The Verl had been on the empty cot for 2 hours, and Mara Teal had not once turned around to look at it. She kept her back to the animal because that was the whole of the arrangement, the entire unwritten treaty between a 200-kilogram ambush predator and a woman with no weapon within reach. She sat at the fold-down work table with the survey slate glowing under her hands, logging soil cores, and behind her the Verl breathed in long, slow drags that fogged the cold air of the shell. Outside, the ashwind screamed against the iron walls the way it had screamed every night for 40 nights, a sound like grit poured over a drum, and inside there was only the tick of the heater coil and that enormous, patient breathing. The cot was the second bunk. The shell had come with two, bolted to opposite walls, because Concord prefab units were stamped out for two-person crews and nobody at the yard had bothered to pull the spare when they dropped a single contractor on a world they expected her to die on. Mara had used the second cot for storage the first 3 nights. Then the ashwind had come, and something had come with it, and now the second cot belonged to whatever the wind drove to her door. She finished the core log, saved it, and did not stand. Standing changed the shape of a person. A thing that hunted by silhouette read a standing human as a different animal than a sitting one, and the Verl had learned the sitting shape and made its peace with it, and she was not going to teach it a new lesson at this hour of the night. She reached instead for the flask, drank, set it down soft. Behind her the breathing hitched. Claws scraped fabric. She heard the cot frame groan as the animal shifted its weight, and the small huffing grunt it made when it turned itself around, and then the breathing went long again. Settling, she let her shoulders down a centimeter. "Easy," she said, not loud. She said it to the wall, to the slate, to nothing. "Nobody's going anywhere." The Verl did not understand the word. It understood the register. 40 nights had taught it that this small, flat voice meant the standing shape would not stand, that the light would stay low, that the wind could not reach past the iron. It made a sound back at her, a single low note down in its chest that she felt in the floor plates more than heard, and Mara let herself smile at the dark slate because there was no one to see her do it. That was the thing about HASP, there was no one to see anything. They had dropped her 61 days ago from a Concord skiff that did not land, that hung 100 meters up on its repulsors and kicked her gear out the belly hatch onto the scree, and then dropped her after it in a descent harness, and the whole time the loadmaster had not looked at her. That was how she'd known. You could always tell in the Concord when they thought you were already dead. They stopped looking at you. They talked past you at the muster desk and signed your chits without meeting your eyes, and when the skiff pulled away, it did not waggle its wings or flash its running lights the way they did for a crew they expected to pick up again. It just climbed and turned and left her standing on a plain of black volcanic gravel under a bruise-colored sky, with 200 days of ration bricks and a survey shell and a slate, on a world the Concord had already half decided to kill. Category Ash. That was what they wanted HASP to read as. Mara had read enough survey briefs to know the shape of the answer they'd sent her to find. A Category Ash world was one with no standing sapient claim, no protected biosphere of record, nothing on it that a chartered consortium was legally obliged to leave alive, which meant the Concord could bring in the crust strippers and the mantle drills and take HASP apart down to its hot iron heart and sell it by the shipload. All they needed was a certified reading. A living surveyor gave them the reading and a fee. A dead surveyor gave them the reading for free, because a contractor who died inside her contract window certified the world lethal by the simple fact of her corpse. They had bet on the corpse. She'd seen it in the loadmaster's shoulders. They'd bet on HASP doing what HASP did to soft things, and they'd bet cheap, one human contractor against a whole world of ways to die. And they had left one cot empty in the shell without ever once imagining what would come to fill it. Mara Teal had every intention of disappointing them. She'd survived the first 10 days on stubbornness and procedure, because procedure was the only thing the Concord had ever given her that was worth a damn. Seal the shell. ration the water, log the world. She logged the ashfalls and the acid dew that ate the finish off her boots, and the way the ground itself went brittle and cold after dark, a creeping frostburn that could take the skin off an unprotected hand in a minute and a life in 10. She logged the scree plains and the glass ridges to the north where the wind had fused the sand into knife-edged sheets, and she logged the first time she saw a Vril, at 400 meters, watching her from the lee of a boulder with its 6 legs folded under it, and its saber tusks catching the last light like wet bone. She had thought then, the way anyone would think, that is the thing that is going to kill me. She had been wrong about which direction the fear ran, but it took the ashwind to teach her. The ashwind was Hasp's real killer, not the cold, not the acid, not the predators, the wind. It came up out of the western caldera fields every night an hour after dark, a scouring freezing gale packed so thick with volcanic grit that it grounded anything with wings, blinded anything with eyes, and stripped the warmth out of anything with blood. Mara had learned to be sealed inside the shell before it hit. She'd watched, through the scarred viewport, what it did to the plain, how it drove everything that lived on Hasp to ground, into burrows and under ledges and down into the crevices of the black rock, because a body caught in the open when the ashwind came was a body the world kept. And she had learned on the 40th night that the Vril had nowhere to den. They were plains hunters, the Vrils, ambush cats of the open scree, built for the flat and the long stalk, and the flat had no caves. When the ashwind came, they scraped themselves into whatever shallow scoop of rock they could find and endured it, and some nights they did not endure it, and in the morning the wind had a new shape in the gravel that the acid dew would take down to bone by noon. Mara had found those shapes. She had logged them too. On the 40th night, the Vril had come to her door. She still did not entirely understand why she had opened it. She had been at the work table, sealed in, warm, alive, doing everything right, and there had been a sound at the hatch under the scream of the wind, not a scratching, nothing so deliberate, just a heavy repeated thud, a body throwing itself against iron because iron was the only thing on the whole plane that was not moving. She had gone to the viewport and put the lamp to it and seen the Vril pressed flat against the base of the door, ash-caked in its fur, one eye crusted shut, its flanks heaving, dying in the way that plains things died on Hasp, slowly in the open in the wind. Procedure said keep the shell sealed. Procedure said a Concord contractor did not open a hardened structure to an apex predator on a category ash world. Procedure was very clear. Myra had opened the door. She told herself afterward a dozen practical reasons. That she was going mad from the solitude and wanted anything alive in the room with her. That she'd wanted to see the animal up close for the survey. That she was tired of logging shapes in the gravel. None of them were the true reason, and she knew it. The true reason was that she'd looked at a thing the world was killing for the crime of being caught in the open. And she'd been a thing the Concord had dropped in the open to be killed, and some knot in her had simply refused, on principle, to let the wind have one more. The Vril had come in low and fast, out of the wind, and then it had stopped dead 3 steps inside the door and stared at her with its one good eye, and for a long moment they had both understood exactly what the situation was. She had no weapon it needed to fear. It had every weapon she needed to fear. The shell was 4 meters on a side, and there was nowhere in it for either of them to go. And the Vril had done the only thing left to do, which was to decide. It had turned away from her, deliberately. It had put its back to the human, the one thing a predator does not do to a threat, and it had limped to the empty cot and dragged itself up onto it and collapsed, and it had not looked at her again until dawn. In the morning, when the wind died and the sky went from bruised to ash-gray, it had risen, shaken itself, and gone to the door and waited there until she opened it, and walked out onto the cooling plain without a backward glance. And Mara had stood in the doorway watching it go, and understood that she had just done something the Concord's entire survey doctrine had no procedure for. She had left the cot turned down that night, folded the thermal blanket back, kept the lamp low, not because she expected the Vril to return, but because leaving it ready cost her nothing, and because a made bed in a dead world was a small argument against the wind. The Vril had returned on the 42nd night, and the 44th, and after that she stopped counting the gaps because there weren't many. It came when the wind was worst. On the calm nights it stayed out on its plane and did its work, and she'd hear it, far off, the cough and scream of a Vril on a kill, and she'd log that too. But when the ash wind came up thick and killing out of the caldera, the Vril came to the shell, and Mara left the cot empty, and the treaty held. She had named it Gray, not a clever name. Its muzzle had gone frost gray down one side from an old cold burn, an ashwind it had barely lived through before it learned where the iron was, and the gray was the first thing you saw of it in the low light. Gray. She said it out loud sometimes, the way you'd say a name to a dog, and the Vril's ear would flick toward the sound and then flick away. And that was the whole conversation, and it was more conversation than she'd had with a living thing in 2 months. Tonight was the worst wind yet. Mara could hear it in the pitch of the scream, half a tone higher than usual, a sound the shell's iron had started to hum along with in a way she did not like. The heater coil was drawing hard. The viewport had gone opaque with caked ash. And on the empty cot behind her, Gray had settled deep, done with the world for the night, secure in the 1 square meter of hasp that the wind had never once been allowed to take. She finished her water, she checked the seals. She turned the lamp down to its lowest amber, the way she did every night now, because she'd learned that the low amber settled the animal and the white overhead startled it. And a startled 200-kilogram ambush predator was not a thing you wanted to share 4 square meters with. Then she did the last thing, the thing she'd started doing around the 50th night without ever quite deciding to. She hummed. 3 notes low, dropping a scrap of something her grandmother used to hum over a stove a very long way from here, so worn down by repetition that it wasn't a tune anymore, just a shape of sound that meant the day was closing, and it was safe to stop watching the dark. She didn't hum it for the Vril. She hummed it for herself, the way she'd always done, the small human ritual of telling her own body that the guard could come down. But the Vril had learned it. When she hummed the 3 dropping notes, Gray's breathing changed. It went slower, deeper, the great body loosening into the cot, and once, only once, weeks ago, the animal had answered it, 3 low notes back, not the same notes. A Vril had no more idea of a tune than the wind did, but 3 sounds, dropping, an answer in the same shape. She had sat very still that night and not logged it, because there was no field on the survey slate for the thing that had just happened, and because she had not entirely trusted herself to write it down without her hand shaking. Mara pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders, set her back against the warm wall, and let herself begin to drift with the enormous breathing at her back and the wind locked out beyond the iron. This was the arrangement. This was the treaty. 1 cot always turned down. 1 human who did not stand up in the dark. 1 Vril who did not look at her while she slept. The Concord had dropped her here to die, and instead she had become the 1 warm, still thing on a world that killed everything caught in the open, and the world had begun, in its own way, to keep her. She was nearly asleep when the priority tone chimed on the slate. She knew what it was before she opened her eyes. There was only one thing on hasp that could make the slate chime, and it was not on hasp at all. It was the Concord, reaching down through the ash and the wind on a hardened channel, and the Concord did not spend the money to reach a contractor it had written off unless the contractor had become, somehow, inconvenient. Mara opened the message with the lamp still low and Gray still breathing at her back, and read it twice, and felt the cold that the wind could never quite get through the iron reach her anyway. Relief and assessment drop inbound. Survey Master OSKETH, Concord Reclamation Authority. Window OPENS in 6 local days. Prepare site for inspection and closeout. All field findings to be surrendered on arrival. close out, surrender all findings. A survey master in person on a world they'd already decided was Category Ash. They were not coming to relieve her. You did not send a survey master to relieve a contractor. You sent a survey master when a contract had gone somewhere the paperwork did not want it to go, and Mara had spent 61 days filling the survey record with the one thing a Category Ash world was not permitted to contain: life that answered to nothing, apex fauna that ranged the surface, a biosphere that was neither dead nor tame. She had logged Gray. She had logged the Dren packs on the glass ridges and the great slow shapes she'd glimpsed moving in the caldera haze at dawn. She had logged, in her flat contractor's prose, a world that was extravagantly, murderously alive. And somewhere up the chain, someone who wanted Hasp dead had read her findings and understood that a living surveyor and a living world were, together, a problem worth the price of a survey master's time. Mara set the slate down. Behind her, Gray shifted, made its low chest note, went still. The wind screamed, 6 days. Well, she said to the dark, to the wall, to the animal that would not look at her, that's going to be a mess. Gray did not answer, but its breathing did not change either, and Mara took what comfort she could from that whatever was coming down out of the sky in 6 days, tonight the treaty still held, and the cot was still full, and the wind was still locked out beyond the iron where it belonged. She slept. She had learned to here, with a predator at her back. It was the Concord she no longer trusted to let her wake. The second night after the message, the wind eased off early, and something with wings came to the door. Mara heard it land, a soft, heavy slap against the iron, membrane on metal, and then a scrabble of claws finding the seam of the hatch. She'd catalogued the sound weeks ago and had a name for the animal from the field guide she'd built herself, one entry at a time in the back pages of the survey record. Skin. A glider. Broad membrane wings stretched between 6 limbs, a flat snub head crowded with heat pits, and along the trailing edge of each wing a row of spurs that beaded with something that was not water. Venom. She'd watched a skin take a plains runner in one silent stoop, and the runner had been dead before the skin folded its wings, not from the fall, from the spurs. The skin only came when the ashwind was thin. Thick wind grounded it and it denned in the ridge cracks like everything else. But on the marginal nights, the nights the wind couldn't quite decide to kill, the skin got caught out too cold to fly well, too proud to crawl into a crack, and it had learned, the way Gray had learned, that there was iron on the plane that stayed warm. Mara opened the door. This was the part she could not have explained to anyone at the Concord yard, the part that would have gotten her pulled from the contract and psych flagged if she'd put it in the log. The skin came in out of the thin wind and it stopped, and it looked at the empty cot, and then it looked at her. And Mara watched a venom glider the length of her arm span do arithmetic, the same arithmetic Gray had done on the 40th night, the calculation every apex thing on Hasp seemed to run when it crossed her threshold. No weapon it needed to fear. Warmth. Stillness. A folded blanket and a low amber lamp and a human who sat down and did not stand. It took the cot. It folded its wings over itself like a man pulling a coat closed, and it tucked its snub head under a wing spur and it slept, and its venom beaded and dried harmless on the thermal blanket, and in the morning it left the way Gray left, without a backward glance, out into the ash-gray dawn on wings that caught the thin light like oiled paper. Different animal, same cot, same treaty. Mara sat at the work table after it had gone and looked at the entry she was about to make in the survey record and understood fully, for the first time, what she had built here without meaning to. It was not that a Vril had adopted her. A Vril adopting a lonely human was a story, a sad, soft story about a woman going strange on a dead world, and she could have lived with being that story. This was something else. This was every apex thing the wind drove to her door, learning, independently, on its own hunter's arithmetic, that the human's iron shell was neutral ground, that the cot was safe, that the still small shape at the table would not stand up in the dark. She had left one cot empty, and the world had turned it into a berth that its apexes passed between them like a shared secret. The Vril did not den with the skin. The skin did not den with the dren. On the open plain they killed each other's young and fought over kills and gave each other a wide cold berth. But they had all, one after another, come in out of the wind and slept the length of a night 3 steps from a woman who could have done nothing at all to stop them, and they had all left her breathing. The word for that was not tame. Mara knew the difference. Tame was a thing you broke to your hand. This was a thing that had looked at her hand and decided on the terms of its own nature that her hand was not the enemy, that the enemy was the wind, and the wind was locked out, and inside the iron there was a truce. She was not their master. She was their neutral ground, the 1 square meter of hasp that no apex had to fight for and no wind could take. She wrote none of that in the survey record. She wrote skin, morphology, venom delivery, thermal-seeking behavior. She wrote it flat and clean the way the Concord liked, and she thought about the survey master coming down in 5 days to close the file, and she thought, if he sees this, he will not understand it as a truce. He will understand it as a hazard, or a specimen, or a lie. And then she thought, colder, or he will understand it perfectly, and that will be worse, because a world where the apex predators keep a human is not a world you can certify as category Ash. She began that night to prepare, not the site the way the message had ordered, herself. She read back through 61 days of her own findings and saw the shape of the argument she'd been building without meaning to. HASP had a biosphere. It had apex fauna with problem-solving behavior, tool-free but plainly intelligent, capable of learning a novel situation, the iron, the human, the truce, and transmitting that learning through their range, because there was no other way to explain how a skin had known to do exactly what a Vril had done. That was not the profile of a category Ash world. That was the profile of a living world with a claim on its own survival, the kind of world that, under Concord charter, could not simply be taken apart for its iron. She had the findings. She had 61 days of clean logs. What she did not have was any illusion that clean logs would be enough against a survey master who had come down personally to make sure the file closed the way someone up the chain wanted it closed. On the 4th night the dren came, and that changed the arithmetic again. Mara had heard the dren packs on the glass ridges for weeks, a high-yipping chorus that ran the ledges at dusk, pack predators, canned in the loose way that Hasp's evolution was canned, long-legged and narrow and built to run prey to death across the fused glass flats. She had never had one at her door. Dren were pack animals. They had the pack for warmth. They piled together in the ridge cracks and rode the wind out in a heap of bodies, and they did not need her iron. But the dren that came on the 4th night was alone, and it was hurt. She saw it on the viewport when she went to check the seals. A single dren, dragging its off-hind leg, its narrow flank raked open in 3 lines that had stopped bleeding and gone bad. Cast out, or lost, or the last of a pack the wind had taken. It stood at the base of her door in the rising ashwind, and it did not throw itself against the iron the way Gray had. It just stood, swaying, waiting, because it had seen, somehow from somewhere, along whatever channel the apexes of Hasp used to pass their learning, that this door opened. Myra opened it. The dren came in and it did the arithmetic and it went to the cot, and it could not get up onto the cot with the ruined leg, so it lay down on the floor beside the cot instead, in the warm, in the still, and it put its long head down on its paws, and it watched her with yellow eyes until it could not keep them open any longer, and then it slept. And Mara sat at the work table and listened to a hurt animal breathe, and around the middle of the night, when the wind was at its worst, she did the thing that she would later understand had been the true turning point of everything that came after. She got up, slowly, in the sitting shape becoming the standing shape as gently as she knew how. The dren's eyes came open and its lip lifted off its teeth and a sound started in its chest, and Mara stopped and hummed the 3 low dropping notes, and the sound in the dren's chest guttered and died. She crossed the shell one slow step at a time. She got the field kit down off the shelf. She knelt not over the animal, beside it, the way she'd learned you knelt beside a thing that could kill you, presenting no height, and she cleaned the 3 bad lines on its flank with the last of her antiseptic while the dren lay rigid and let her. Its yellow eyes rolled to watch her hands, its whole body a drawn bowstring, and it did not close its jaws on her wrist, though her wrist was a hand's breadth from its jaws the entire time. When she was done, she went back to the worktable and sat down and made herself small again, and the dren let its breath out all at once, a long shuddering sigh, and slept for real. In the morning it could put weight on the leg. It went to the door and waited, and she let it out, and it stood a moment on the cooling plain looking back at the shell. The first of them, she realized, that had ever looked back, and then it turned and ran, low and fast and only a little lame, north toward the glass ridges where its kind ran the ledges at dusk. 2 nights after that, there were 3 dren at her door. Not a pack hunting, a pack come to den. The hurt one in the middle, healed enough to travel, and 2 others flanking it. And Mara understood that the channel the apexes used to pass their learning ran through the dren packs faster than it ran anywhere, because dren were social and dren talked, in their yipping ridge-running way, and the hurt one had gone home and told its pack, in whatever grammar dren used, that there was iron on the plain that opened, and a human inside it that did not stand up in the dark, and a truce. She could not fit 3 dren and the cot into 4 square meters with any comfort, but they made it work, the way animals denning together make it work. The 2 whole ones on the floor, the healed one on the cot because the pack put it there. A hierarchy of injury Mara didn't fully follow, and all 3 of them a single breathing mass in the warm while the wind screamed and the acid dew ate the plain outside. And Mara sat up half that night watching 3 apex pack predators sleep in a heap in her survey shell and thought, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she could not show this to the survey master. And then, right behind it, harder, she could not hide it either. There was ash in every seam of the shell in the shape of claws. There was venom dried on the blanket. There were dren tracks worn into the gravel at her door, a hand deep. The world had left its mark on her one small square of neutral ground, and there was no cleaning it off before the sky opened in 3 days, and the Concord came down to close the file. It was the transmission that frightened her most when she let herself think about it, not the animals, the transmission. She had been trained to survey a food chain, and a food chain was a simple, brutal thing. This eats that flees this, and every animal in it was alone with its own hunger. What she had on Hasp was not that. A dying Vril had learned the iron opened, and somehow a skin had known it, and somehow a dren pack had known it, and somehow the auric had come down out of the caldera already knowing to knock. They did not den together, they did not hunt together. On the plain they killed each other's young. And yet a thing one of them learned at her door on a Tuesday was known to a different species by the weekend, carried across kilometers of scree through a channel she could not see and did not understand. And the only word she had for a network that passed learning between rival apex predators across an entire biosphere was a word the Concord Charter reserved for exactly one thing, and that thing was not vermin. She did not write the word down. She was afraid of what it would do to the file, and afraid, a little, of what it said about the world she had been sent to kill. That Hasp was not a plane full of hungers, but something closer to a single mind wearing 1,000 sets of teeth, and that it had, for reasons of its own, decided to let her live inside it. She tested it, in the small ways she could. One night she moved the empty cot from the west wall to the east wall, and the Vril that came in that night crossed the shell without hesitation and lay down on it in its new place, as though the cot's location had been transmitted along with everything else. One night she left the lamp dark and only the heater on, and the dren that came scratched at the viewport until she lit it, because the low amber was part of the promise now, and a promise with a piece missing was not the promise. Everything she tried, the world had already accounted for. She was not training them. They were teaching her the shape of the treaty they had agreed among themselves, one correction at a time, and she was the slow student, and the kept ground was a thing they were building together in a grammar she would never fully learn. So she stopped trying to hide it and started trying to understand it, because understanding it was the only weapon she had. She spent the last 3 days doing the only thing she'd ever been good at, which was survey. But she surveyed the truce instead of the world. She logged which animals came on which nights and mapped it against the wind. Thick wind brought gray, and the dren thin wind brought the skin. And on the marginal nights she never knew which arithmetic would win until she heard what hit the door. She logged the way they arrived. Never together, never fighting, each one doing its own hunter's calculation on the threshold, none of them ever testing her, not once in all the nights. She logged the way they left. At first light, always back to their killing, the truce dissolving with the dawn as cleanly as it formed with the wind. And on the last page of her private field guide, the one that was not the Concord survey record, she wrote down the thing she was going to have to make an alien administrator believe against his own contract, his own bonus, and his own certainty. She wrote it plain. The apex fauna of HFY are intelligent, they learn, they teach one another, and they have collectively recognized a single human structure as neutral ground and a single human as its keeper. This is not domestication. This is a treaty. A world whose apex predators can make a treaty is not a world you are permitted to strip. She read it back and it looked on the page like exactly what it was, the truth, and not nearly enough. On the third night, the night before the drop, the wind came up harder than she'd ever heard it, and the Auric came to her door for the first time, and Mara Teal learned that she had been wrong about the top of the food chain on HFY. It did not throw itself against the iron, it knocked. That was the only word Mara had for it afterward, and she knew how it sounded. But the Auric came out of the worst wind HFY had ever thrown at her, and it struck the hatch 3 times, slow and deliberate and enormous, a blow that rang the whole shell like a bell and rattled the slate off the work table, and then it waited. 3 blows. A pause. It knew the door opened. It was telling the door to open. Mara went to the viewport with the lamp, and could not, at first, make sense of what filled it. Gray was the size of a large hound. The Auric was the size of the skiff that had dropped her. It stood on 4 columnar legs, its back higher than the shell's roofline, its whole body plated in overlapping slabs of something between horn and stone that the ashwind had scoured to a dull pewter shine. Its head was low and broad and armored like the prow of a boat, and set into that prow were 2 small deep eyes that caught the lamplight and threw it back amber, and it was looking at the viewport, at the lamp, at her, with an attention so total that Mara felt it in her teeth. She understood several things in the space of one breath. She understood why she had only ever seen the Aurics as slow shapes in the caldera haze. They were too big to den anywhere but the deep caldera, and they came out onto the plain only when something drove them. And tonight the wind had driven this one down out of the fields toward the one warm thing on the black scree. She understood that this was the animal the dren ran from, and the virile gave a wide berth and the skin would not stoop on. This was the apex over the apexes, the thing at the very top, and it was standing at her door in a killing wind, and it had knocked. And she understood, last and coldest, that it would not fit through the door, and that it knew it would not fit through the door, and that it had come anyway. Mara opened the hatch. The wind came in like a live thing, ash and cold and grit, and behind it the Auric's head, lowering, filling the doorway, the armored prow of its face pushing into the warm as far as the frame would let it, which was not far, the great shoulders jammed against the iron, the body still out in the wind, only the head and neck inside. And it stopped. It did the arithmetic. Mara watched the largest predator on HFY run the same calculation a dying virile had run on the 40th night, its amber eyes going from her to the low lamp to the empty cot to her again, and she stood very still in the wind with her hair whipping and the cold burning her face, and she did the only thing she knew how to do. She sat down, on the floor, right there in the open doorway and the wind in front of it. She made the standing shape into the smallest sitting shape she had, and she looked up at the armored head 3 feet from her own, and she hummed the 3 low dropping notes with her voice shaking from the cold. The auric went still all over. It could have taken the whole front off the shell with one heave of those shoulders. It could have taken her head off with a turn of that prow. Instead, it stood in the doorway with its body in the killing wind and its head in the warm, and it lowered itself by degrees, until its heavy jaw came to rest on the floor plates of the shell, inside in the warm, in the still, 3 feet from where Mara sat, and it let out a breath that fogged the whole room white, and it closed its amber eyes. It could not come in. So it brought as much of itself in as the door would allow, and it slept like that, head in and body out, all night, in the worst wind Hasp had ever made, while the smaller warmth of the shell washed over its closed eyes, and the human sat in the doorway between the animal and the wind and did not move, could not move, would not have moved for anything in the charted dark. That was the night Mara stopped thinking of it as her survey shell. Somewhere in the small hours she got the spare thermal blanket, the one from her own cot, not the treaty cot, and she draped it over as much of the auric's armored head as it would cover, and the auric's eye came open and looked at her and closed again, and that was permission or gratitude or nothing at all. But she took it as the first and cried a little in the dark where no one could see, not from fear, from something she didn't have a word for that was closer to being finally, after 64 days. Not alone. In the morning the wind fell. The auric woke, drew its head out of the doorway slow and careful, backed away from the shell 3 heavy steps, and stood on the cooling plain in the ash-gray light looking at her the way the healed Dren had looked at her, the backward look, the look that meant something had been noted and would be carried. Then it turned and went, a pewter mountain moving north toward the caldera, and the ground shook under its going, and Mara stood in her doorway with the treaty blanket in her arms and watched the top of Hasp's whole living world walk away from her door where it had slept the night. 6 hours later the sky opened, and the Concord came down. Seshev the 9th clutch had drawn corpse detail before, and had made her peace with it the way you made peace with the low, cold, necessary work that fell to a junior contract tech with no clutch standing and a debt bond to work off. You flew down to the dead world. You recovered what was left of the Surveyor for the record and the family stipend. You certified the site. You flew back up. It was grim and it was quiet and nobody watched over your shoulder while you did it, which was the only mercy of it. Sesh had done it 4 times. She knew the shape of it. This was not the shape of it. She sat in the drop skiff's second seat with her manipulator claws laced tight in her lap and watched Hasp come up through the ash on the descent screens, and beside her in the command seat sat Survey Master Oskith, and Oskith had not spoken since they broke the upper cloud. That was its own kind of wrong. Oskith was a talker. On the long fall down from the reclamation barge, he had talked the whole way. About the contract, about the strip yield projections for Hasp's iron mantle, about the incompetence of field contractors, and the necessity of personal oversight, and the several ways in which a survey master's time was too valuable to be spent chasing a closeout that a junior tech in a body bag should have handled. He had made it very clear, without once saying it, that he had come down himself because someone above him had made him, and that he intended to close the file on Hasp so cleanly, and so fast that the someone above him would never have cause to send him down a gravity well again. And then the descent screens had cleared, and the survey shell had come up on the plain below them, and Oskith had stopped talking. Because the shell was not the tomb they had come to open. It stood square and sealed and lit, a thread of heater vapor rising from its stack, and around it the black gravel of the plain was worn into paths, deep paths, animal paths, radiating out from the door like spokes, and the iron of the shell's walls, when the skiff's lights swept across it on the turn, was scored from base to roofline with the long, bright parallel gouges of enormous claws. Not one animal's claws. Sesh had grown up Clutchpore on a border world with its own bad fauna, and she knew claw sign. And she was looking at 4 different kinds of it at least, layered over each other, weeks deep. A whole catalog of apex marks worn into a Concord prefab that was supposed to be sitting on a category ash world where nothing large was supposed to be alive at all. "The Surveyor is dead," Osgood said. It was the first thing he'd said in 20 minutes, and he said it the way you said a thing you needed to be true. "Read the site heat." Sesh read the site heat. "One large body inside, warm and mobile," she said. "Human range, Master, she's—" "Read it again." "She's alive, Master. Moving." There's Sesh checked the returns twice because she did not want to be wrong in front of a survey master. "There's no other large body in the structure right now. But the residual heat sign in the gravel around the door, Master, something very large bedded down against that structure last night. The thermal ghost is still cooling. It's bigger than the skiff." Osgood's 4 eyes did not turn from the screen. Sesh had worked under him long enough to read the set of his mouth plates, and what she read there was not surprise. It was calculation. The kind of fast, cold reallocation of a plan that Sesh had seen him do at the muster desk when a contract went sideways. The visible mechanism of a mind deciding, very quickly, that a problem had just changed shape and would need to be unshaped before anyone above him found out it had ever had a shape at all. "Set us down at 40 meters, Osgood said. "Kennel detail deploys first. Full harness on the beasts. I want the site secured before I so much as open my hatch." "Master, if the fauna are apex scale, the kennel beasts may not." "The kennel beasts," Osgood said, "are Concord war stock, bred and broken across 9 reclamations, and they will do exactly what they are commanded to do, which is more than I can say for a field tech who has been on the ground 4 minutes and is already telling a survey master his business." He turned his head, finally, and put all 4 eyes on her, and Sesh dropped her gaze to her laced claws the way clutch standing required. "The Surveyor," he said, softer, "has been alone on a lethal world for 64 days. She has, at minimum, gone strange. At maximum, she has falsified her findings to inflate her fee or her survival bonus, which is a fraud on the Concord and a matter I am fully empowered to close. Whatever is out there, whatever she has done to that site, we are going to secure it, document it, and correct it. This world is Category Ash. It reads Category Ash. It will close Category Ash. Do you understand me, Tech?" "Yes, Master," Sesh said. She did not understand him, but she understood the order, and the order was enough, and she flew the skiff down through the last of the ash toward the one lit warm thing on a plain of black gravel scored with the marks of a world that had not read the contract. The skiff touched down at 40 meters out, the kennel ramp dropped, and the 6 Concord war beasts came down it in their harnesses, low and heavy and eager, the broken war stock of 9 dead worlds, muzzles up and reading the wind, and Sesh watched through the canopy as every one of the 6 went, at the same instant from eager to wrong. They stopped at the bottom of the ramp, all 6, muzzles still up, reading the plane, reading the paths worn into the gravel, reading the claw sign on the iron and the great cooling thermal ghost by the door. And the broken war stock of the Concord, that had run down fleeing colonists across 9 reclamations and never once balked, planted their feet on the black gravel of Hasp and would not advance. And one of them, the biggest, the pack lead, a scarred old brute Sesh had seen take a charging draft animal off its feet, put its belly to the ground and its tail between its legs, and made a sound she had never heard a Concord war beast make in her life. It whined. In the command seat, Survey Master Osgood watched his warstock cower on the threshold of a Category Ash world, and said nothing at all, and Sesh understood that whatever they had flown down here to close, it was not going to close the way the contract wanted it to. Mara watched the whole thing from her doorway with her arms crossed, and her face set to the flat contractor's comm she'd worn at 100 muster desks, and she did not go out to help the kennel master with his cowering beasts, because it was not her job, and because it was, quietly, the most satisfying thing she had seen in 64 days. She'd known what would happen the moment the ramp dropped and the smell of the war stock reached her. She'd smelled it herself, the reek of animals broken to a harness, fierce sweat and old blood, and the particular sourness of a predator that has been made to kill things it did not choose to kill. The apexes of HFY killed clean, for the plain reasons: food, range, the young. These 6 things that came down the Concord ramp killed because a claw on a control yoke told them to. And every animal on HFY for 100 kilometers would have known the difference in one breath of the wind. And known, too, that 6 broken things at the foot of a ramp were not a pack and not a threat, only a misery on legs. The kennel master hauled and cursed and shocked his lead beast up off its belly, and got the 6 of them into a ragged line. And Mara watched a tall, plated alien in a survey master's gray come down the ramp behind them with the careful high step of someone who did not want the black gravel to touch his boots. "You are the contractor Teal," Oskith said, when he'd crossed the paths worn into the plain and stopped a precise and prudent 10 meters from her door. He did not offer a claw. Corvin of standing did not touch contractors. "You will step away from the structure. My detail will secure and inspect the site. You will surrender your findings and your slate. You will answer for the condition of conquered property." He tipped his armored head at the cross-cord iron behind her. "You have a great deal to answer for." "Survey master." Mara did not step away from the structure. "You came down a day early." "I'd have cleaned up." "I came down," Oskith said, "because a contractor on a Category Ash world has filed 61 days of findings describing a living biosphere with apex fauna, which is either the most consequential survey error in the Reclamation Authority's history or a deliberate fraud designed to inflate a survival bonus and obstruct a lawful strip mining charter. I came down to determine which. Step away from the structure, contractor." "It's not an error," Mara said. "And it's not a fraud, it's just true." She uncrossed her arms slow, and she saw the kennel master flinch and the war beast's heads come around, and she kept her hands open and low and visible. "Your file's wrong, survey master. HFY is an ash. There's a whole living world out here, and the top of it sleeps against that wall most nights. And if you send those poor broken animals of yours nosing around my door, I can't answer for what comes down out of the caldera to see about it." Oskith's 4 eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat, contractor?" "No," Mara said, and she meant it. And that was the thing he couldn't read, that a threat and a warning wore the same words. "It's a survey finding, same as the rest. You want to close this world Category Ash, you first have to explain the apex predator that bedded down against this shell last night. The one your war stock can smell all over the gravel, the one that scared them off the ramp. You want to explain that on a dead world." She watched Oskith look, he couldn't help it, at his cowering beasts, and then at the great cooling thermal ghost worn into the gravel by her door, a bedded shape bigger than his skiff, and she watched him do the arithmetic. Not the hunter's arithmetic the apexes ran. A different, worse arithmetic, the kind that ran through profit and charter and the someone above him who'd sent him down. She saw him reach the bottom of it. She saw his mouthplate set. "You have been alone too long, contractor," he said gently, "the way you spoke to the sick. You have made pets of hazards and stories of tracks. It happens. The Reclamation Authority is not without compassion for what solitude does to a soft mind." He turned to the kennel master. "Secure the structure. Sedate tag protocol for any fauna that presents. I want a specimen. A dead world produces no apex specimens, so if this contractor's stories have any body to them at all, we will put that body in a stasis crate and fly it home, and it will answer every question there is." He looked back at Mara. "One way or another, contractor, this world closes on schedule. Whether it closes as a fraud or as a tragedy is, at this point, entirely up to you." And there it was. Mara had spent 64 days learning to read what an animal meant under what it did, and she read Oskith clean. He did not care whether HFY was alive. He had known it might be before he ever left the barge. A survey master did not come down a gravity well for a clean file. He had come to make sure that whatever was down here got unmade before it could reach the record. And he had just told her, in the soft, compassionate voice of the Reclamation Authority, that he intended to trap one of her apexes in a stasis crate as a specimen, and that if the world's living status became inconvenient enough, a contractor who had gone strange and died among her pets would close the file just as well as a fraud who had lied. Sedate and tag, Mara said, on an animal that outweighs your skiff. On any animal that presents. Oscith was already turning away, already climbing back toward the clean high step of his ramp. Kennel Master, the contractor is not to enter or leave the structure without my authorization. Tech this to the small nervous one who'd come down behind him, the one with the debt bond in the set of her shoulders. You will inventory the site and the contractor's findings, all of them. I want to know exactly what she thinks she has seen before the dark makes a liar or a corpse of her. We hold position through one local night. If her stories are true, something will come. And when it comes, we will crate it and this world will close. He went up his ramp, and Mara stood in her doorway and understood that the survey master had just told her, without knowing it, exactly how he was going to lose. Because something would come. The wind was already stirring in the west, the light already going from ash to bruise, and something always came. And it was not going to walk into a stasis crate. Oscith spent the last hour of daylight inspecting the shell, and Mara let him, because there was nothing in it she could hide and nothing she wanted to. He came in on his careful high step with 2 of the kennel detail behind him, and he stood in the middle of 4 square meters that reeked of animal and warmth, and read the whole story of her 64 days off the walls without her saying a word. The cloth cord iron, the venom beads dried on the treaty blanket, the dren tracks worn a hand deep in the gravel by the door, the 2 cots, one hers and one for the wind. He picked up her private field guide off the work table and thumbed through it, and Mara watched a survey master read the only honest record she had made on HASP, the one that used words like treaty and kept ground and carries a debt, and she watched his mouthplates set harder with every page. This is not a survey record, he said. This is a diary, a sick one. He set it down as though it had a temperature. You have named them. You have named the hazards, contractor, the way a child names the dark so it will not be afraid of it. Do you know what a naming does in the field? It tells me your judgment is gone. A surveyor who names her fauna cannot certify them. Every finding in here is compromised by sentiment, and sentiment is exactly the thing the Reclamation Authority pays a surveyor to leave at home. He was pleased, Mara could see it. He had come down looking for a way to void her record and she had handed it to him, a field guide full of pet names. This will not survive review. None of it. A strange woman's diary against a survey master's certification. You have given me the fraud, contractor. You wrote it yourself. You keep saying fraud, Mara said, but you haven't asked me one question about the world. Not one. You've been down here 2 hours and you haven't asked me what eats what, or what the wind does, or why your own warstock won't leave the ramp. A man who thought I was lying would be trying to catch me in it. You're not trying to catch me. You already know I'm not lying. You're just trying to make sure the truth doesn't get filed. She held his 4 eyes. That's not a survey inspection, survey master. That's a cover-up looking for a diary to burn. And you found one. Good for you. It won't matter by morning. Oscith looked at her for a long moment and did not deny it, because a Corvin of standing did not lie to a contractor he had already written off. It was beneath the office. And that, more than anything he'd said, told Mara exactly how much danger she was in. He turned and went out and left the field guide on the table and had one of the kennel detail photograph every page of it for the record of her unfitness, and went up his ramp to wait for the dark to make a liar or a corpse of her, whichever came first. The war beasts watched him go from the perimeter belly down, and would not so much as lift their heads when he passed. Mara noted that. She was learning to note what the broken things did, and what they would not do, and a war beast that would not raise its head to its own master at dusk on a rising wind was a war beast that had already, in some place under the breaking, begun to choose. The nervous one was called Sesh. She said so quietly. When she came to inventory the findings and Oskith was back up in the skiff, and the kennel master was setting his cowering beasts in a perimeter that they clearly wanted no part of. She came to the door with her slate and her laced claws, and she said, "I am Sesh, contract tech. I am to inventory your findings." And then she looked past Mara into the shell, at the two cots, at the low amber lamp, at the treaty blanket folded on the second bunk with the dried venom beads still on it, and Mara watched the alien's 4 eyes go slowly wide. "You leave it made," Sesh said. It was not a question about inventory. It came out of her before she could stop it, the way true things did. "The second bed, you leave it turned down." "I leave it empty," Mara said. "There's a difference. Coming out of the wind, Tech. It's going to be a long night, and your survey master's about to learn some things, and you're going to want to be inside iron when he does." Sesh should not have gone in. Every line of her debt bond and her clutch standing said inventory, the findings from the threshold and report. But there was heater vapor curling warm out of the door, and the bruised light was going out of the west, and the war beasts in the perimeter were belly down and whining. And Sesh had grown up clutchpoor on a border world with bad fauna, and some old childhood part of her recognized the shape of what she was looking at before her trained mind could name it. A made bed. A low lamp, warm iron on a killing plane. She had seen her own grandmother leave the byre door on the latch in the bad seasons, so that the border world's own cast-out things could come into the warm and not freeze, and take nothing, and go at dawn. And she had been told it was a foolish, soft border world custom that no proper Concord clutch would ever keep. She went in. She sat where the human pointed on the floor back to the warm wall, and the human sat too and did not stand, and the lamp stayed low. "When it comes," Mara said, "whatever comes, you do exactly 3 things. You stay sitting, you keep your claws where it can see them, and you don't make a sound. Can you do that?" The survey master ordered. "The survey master's up in his skiff behind a hatch," Mara said. "You're down here in the iron with me. When the wind comes up, Tech, the only law that's going to matter is the one that's kept this cot for 64 days, and it's a simpler law than anything in your charter. Warm and still and neutral. You sit, you show your hands, you keep quiet, and you'll walk out of here at dawn. Everybody who's kept those 3 things has walked out at dawn." Mara looked at the door, where the first grit of the ashwind had begun to hiss against the iron. "That's the whole treaty. That's the only thing I've built out here worth anything. I call it kept ground. Hearth kept ground. The 1 square meter of this whole murdering world where nothing has to fight." Sesh wrote none of it in the inventory. She would think about that later, that from the first hour she had understood, in the part of her that was still a clutchpoor child on a border world, that this was not a thing you put in a Concord record to be closed. She sat with her back to the warm wall and her claws open in her lap, and she watched the human woman hum 3 low notes at the rising dark, and outside the wind came up, and something began to move on the plain. The war beasts in the perimeter started to scream. It was gray. Mara knew the gait before the animal reached the door, the particular rolling 6-legged lope of a verl coming in out of thick wind, unhurried, certain, a predator that had made this walk 40 times and knew the iron would open. She heard it come up the worn path through the scream of the ashwind, heard the war beasts in the perimeter lose what was left of their nerve, and then she heard the thing she had been dreading since the skiff came down, the kennel master's voice, cracking high over the wind, and the whine of a capture yoke spinning up. "Contact, large contact, west path. Sedatin tag. "No," Mara said, and she was up off the floor and at the door faster than she'd moved in 2 months, all her careful stillness gone, because there was a difference between the treaty and this, and the difference was about to get an animal killed. She hit the hatch release and the wind took the door out of her hands, and there was gray, 20 meters out on the worn path, frozen midlope in the beam of the skiff's flood, its frost-gray muzzle up, its saber tusks bright, caught between the human's lit door and the ring of screaming broken things, and the alien with the capture yoke rising to his shoulder. "Gray," Mara said, not loud. She'd learned 2 months ago that loud was the wrong tool. She stood in her lit doorway with the wind tearing at her, and she pitched the 3 low dropping notes under the scream of the gale, the settling hum, the sound that had never once in 64 nights failed to bring the Vril in. "Gray, here, to me. Leave them here." The Vril's head snapped to her voice. And the whole plane held its breath, the human in the door, the alien tech frozen on the floor behind her, the kennel master with his yoke half raised, the war beast's belly down and howling, and Gray looked at the capture yoke, and looked at the lit door, and did the arithmetic one more time. Then it broke from the flood beam in a low gray blur, not at the kennel master, not at the war beasts, straight for the door, straight for her. 40 meters of open ground eaten in a breath, and the kennel master shouted and fired. The capture yoke was built to drop a fleeing colonist, a soft 2-legged thing, and it was calibrated for that mass and that speed. It caught Gray a glancing blow across the haunches as the Vril went past, and the sedative barb that should have gone deep into muscle skated off the dense wall of a Vril's flank and hung there by a thread, pumping a dose meant for a body a third the size into a shallow wound. And Gray screamed. The first time Mara had ever heard the animal make a sound of pain, and hit the doorway at full speed, and came through it into the shell like a landslide. Mara went down under 200 kilograms of terrified, half-drugged apex predator, and knew, in the half-second she had to know anything, that this was how it ended, that she had finally taught the Vril the lesson she'd spent 2 months not teaching it, that the door was not safe, that the human had brought the yoke, and that a frightened Vril in an enclosed space with the thing it now blamed was going to do what a Vril did. Gray stopped with its jaws at her throat. She felt the heat of them, the wet of them, the saber tusks laid cold against the side of her neck. She felt the whole shuddering, drugged weight of the animal pinning her to the floor plates, its heart going like a drum against her chest, the sedative dragging at it, its one clear eye rolled down to look at her from 6 inches away, wild and betrayed and asking, in the only grammar it had, the only question that mattered, "You? Was it you?" "No," Mara whispered. Her hands were open on the floor, empty still, the way she'd knelt beside a hurt Dren a lifetime ago. "Not me, never me, easy, you know me. Easy, Gray, it's kept ground, it's still kept ground. Nobody's going anywhere." She hummed the 3 notes with a 200-kilogram predator's teeth at her throat and the sedative pulling the animal down on top of her, and Gray's clear eye held hers, and then the tusks lifted off her neck. The great head sagged. The drug took it, and the Vril slid off her and onto the floor of the shell half-conscious, its flanks heaving, the barb still hanging from its haunch, and Mara scrambled up onto her knees and got a hand on its neck and felt the enormous pulse slamming under the fur, and understood that Gray had, in the last clear second it had, chosen to believe her over the evidence of its own body. It had come through the door with a barb in its flank, and it had put its teeth on her throat, and it had asked, and she had answered, and it had believed the answer, and that was not tame, that was nothing like tame. That was a thing at the top of a world's food chain, deciding with the last of its mind to trust one human's word against its own pain. Sesh was pressed into the far corner of the shell with all 4 eyes wide and both claws clamped over her mouth plates, doing the second and third things Mara had told her, staying sitting, staying silent, and failing entirely at the calm. And in the doorway, filling it, backlit by the skiff flood with the ashwind howling around him, stood Survey Master Oskith, who had come down out of his skiff after all to see his specimen taken, and who was looking at the drugged apex predator on the floor of the shell and the human kneeling over it with her hand on its neck, and whose mouth plates were set in an expression that Sesh, watching, recognized with a lurch of her stomach. Not fear, not all satisfaction. "There," Oskith said, There is your dead world's apex contractor, sedated, present. Crateable. He lifted a claw, and the kennel master came up behind him with the stasis crate on a grav sled, the crate that would hold a body the size of the drugged Viril, and Mara understood that Oskith had gotten exactly what he'd come down the gravity well for. Not a clean file, a specimen. Proof in a box that HASP had apex fauna, proof he could control, proof he could present or bury as the someone above him required, proof that took the world's living status out of a strange contractor's slate and put it in a Concord stasis crate where it belonged to the Reclamation Authority and to no one else. Kennel master, crate it. Contractor, step away from Concord property. It's not property, Mara said. She had not moved her hand from Gray's neck. It's a living creature on its own world, and your yoke put a colonist dose of sedative into a body 3 times the mass, and if you crate it now, the cold shock will kill it before you clear the atmosphere. You'll have a corpse, survey master. A dead specimen proves nothing but that you killed it. She was lying about the dose. She had no idea what the sedative would do, but she watched the lie land, watched Oskith hesitate, because a dead specimen was worth far less to him than a live one. A dead apex could be called a fraud's taxidermy, a lucky carcass, a hoax. A live apex in a Concord crate was an asset, and in the half-second of his hesitation, Mara played the only card she had left, which was the truth she'd spent 64 days learning, and he had spent his whole life refusing. You want it alive, she said. Then you leave it here till the drug clears because it will not survive the crate cold on top of the overdose, and I'm the only one on this plane who can keep it still while it comes out of the sedative. You crate it now, you lose your specimen. You leave it with me till dawn, it lives, and you can argue about whose property it is in the morning. She held his 4 eyes with her flat contractor's calm. Your choice, survey master. A live asset at dawn or a dead one now. You didn't come down a gravity well for a dead one. Oskith looked at her for a long moment while the wind screamed and his broken beasts howled and his tech shook in the corner, and his specimen breathed its enormous drugged breaths on the floor of the shell. Mara watched him weigh it. Watched the Profitan charter arithmetic run behind his 4 eyes, the calculation of a mind that did not believe in treaties or kept ground or the settling hum, that believed only in assets and closeouts and the someone above him. Dawn, Oskith said, the tech stays with you. She will monitor the specimen's vitals and she will report to me on the hour. If it dies, that is your fraud and your fee gone, and this world closes as a tragedy in the morning either way. If it lives, he stepped back out of the doorway into the wind. It goes in the crate at first light, and we discuss which category of criminal you are on the flight up. He turned. Over his shoulder flat. Enjoy your last night with your pet contractor. Kennel master, reset the perimeter. If anything else comes out of that wind, yoke it. We are going to leave this world with a full crate. The hatch stayed open a moment on the howling dark, and then the wind swung it shut, and Mara knelt on the floor of her shell with her hand on the neck of a drugged apex predator, and across from her, a shaking alien tech uncovered her mouth plates, and between them the low amber lamp burned, and outside the survey master went back up his ramp to wait for dawn and his crate, having decided, Mara could see it as clearly as if he'd said it, that a plane full of apex fauna was not a living world with a claim on its survival, but a plane full of assets that had been sitting uncounted on the Reclamation Authority's books, and that the smartest thing he could do with a night on HASP was fill his crate as many times as the wind would let him. He was going to keep yoking them. Every animal the wind drove to her door all night, he was going to try to put in a box. Mara looked down at Gray, half-conscious, betrayed, and trusting in the same breath, and she looked at the door, and she thought about the Dren pack that would come if the wind held, and the skin on the thin nights, and the auric that had knocked, that would come down out of the caldera into a plane full of capture yokes and screaming broken beasts, and an alien who thought the top of a living world was an uncounted asset. Tech, she said quietly, Sesh, I need you to do something that's going to cost you your bond. Sesh looked up from the vitals reader she'd been ordered to hold, her 4 eyes still wide, and something in them had already changed, had been changing since the human hummed 3 notes at a predator with its teeth on her throat, and the predator had chosen to believe her. "What?" Sesh whispered. "I need you to help me warn them off," Myra said, "before the wind brings the next one in." There was no warning the plane, of course. That was the cruelty of it, and Mara knew it even as she said the words. She could not go out into a killing ashwind with a lamp and turn away animals that came to her door by instinct and memory across kilometers of black scree. The treaty had no signal for stop. It had only the open door and the low lamp and the still shape at the table, and every one of those said the same thing to the wind-driven dark. "Here is warm, here is safe, come." What she could do, what she and Sesh did, in the long first third of that night while Gray came up slow out of the sedative on the floor between them, was smaller and colder. They killed the lamp at the viewport. They dropped a thermal shroud over the door seam, so the warmth would not bleed out onto the plane and call. They made the shell, as far as they could, dark and cold and closed, so that an animal coming up the worn path would find no open door and no low amber light and would turn, please, turn, back into the wind and the ridge cracks, and away from the ring of capture yokes waiting in the dark. It half worked. It was the worst thing Mara ever did on Hasp, and it half worked, and the half that didn't work she carried afterward for the rest of her life. The dren came a little after the middle of the night. Not 1, not 3. The whole pack, 9 of them, the healed one she'd tended somewhere in the middle of the wedge, come down off the glass ridges in the thick of the ashwind to the one place on the plain that had kept them, running the worn path in formation the way they ran prey, low and fast and trusting, straight into a perimeter of Concord capture yokes, and a shell gone dark and cold and shut against them. Mara heard the change in the wind that was the pack arriving. She heard the kennel masters shout. She heard the yokes spin up, and she was at the shrouded viewport tearing the cloth down with Sesh grabbing at her arms to stop her, and she got the shroud off in time to see it by the skiff flood. 9 dren in the worn path, checking, milling, confused, the door dark, the light gone, the safe place suddenly not safe, and the ring of yokes closing, and the broken war beasts loosed off their leashes at last into a fight they'd been bred for, and it went to pieces in seconds the way these things did. The dren were faster than the war stock and smarter than the yokes, and most of the pack broke and scattered back into the wind untouched, because a dren pack that finds a den turned against it does not stay to argue. Most of them. But the yokes caught one, the way the yoke had caught Gray, a glancing overdose across the flank. And the war beasts caught another, the smallest, a young one at the back of the wedge, and the war beasts had been loosed off the leash by an alien who thought the top of a living world was an asset, and they were broken things that killed because they were told to, and they did not know how to stop, and Mara watched through the viewport, unable to reach it, unable to stop it, as the Concord's warstock killed a young dren on the worn path 20 meters from the door that had healed its packmate. Then the wind took the pack, and the plain went dark and empty again, and there was a shape in the gravel that the acid dew would take down to bone by noon. Mara stood at the viewport with her hand flat against the cold iron and did not make a sound. Behind her on the floor, Gray had come fully awake at the noise, up on its haunches, the drug burned off by adrenaline, its ears flat and its clear eye fixed on the viewport and its lip off its teeth, and it was making a sound Mara had never heard it make, not the pain scream from the yoke, not the low chest note of settling. A new sound. Low and steady and cold, and it did not stop. "They killed a pup," Sesh whispered. She was at the viewport too now, her bond forgotten, her 4 eyes reflecting the skiff flood. The perimeter, the survey master's beasts they killed, she could not finish it. On her Clutchpore border world they had left the buyer door on the latch so the cast-out things would not freeze, and she had just watched a Concord kennel detail kill a young thing that had come to a door for warmth, and something in her that the debt bond had spent 4 reclamations flattening stood slowly back up. "That was a child," she said. "It came to the warm and she turned to Mara. "This is not survey, this is not closeout. What is he doing?" "Filling his crate," Mara said. Her voice was very flat, and making his tragedy, a contractor who died among her pets. He said it himself. He doesn't care which animal goes in the box or which one dies on the path tech. They're all the same to him. Assets and a body count. She looked at Gray, at the low cold sound the Vril would not stop making, and she understood that the arithmetic on HASP had just changed one final time, and that she was the only person on the plane who could see the whole shape of what was coming. But he got one thing wrong. He thinks these are animals. They are animals. They're apex predators of a living world that make treaties and teach each other and carry a debt, Mara said. The Dren pack healed with my antiseptic. The Vril trusted my word with a barb in its flank. The Auric brought me its own blanket to keep. She turned from the viewport. He killed a pup on the kept ground's doorstep tech, in front of the whole plane. And the whole plane is going to know it by dawn because that's how this world works. It teaches each other everything. He didn't fill a crate tonight. He started a war and he doesn't even know he's in it. As if the plane had heard her, the ashwind rose another half-tone, and out of it, far off from the direction of the caldera, came a sound that stopped even Gray's low cold note in the Vril's throat. It was deep. It was so deep Mara felt it in the floor plates before she heard it, the way she'd felt the Auric's knock. But this was bigger than the Auric. This came up through the rock of the whole plane, a long descending groan like the world itself clearing its throat, and it rolled across the scree from the west and died away into the wind. And then it came again, closer. Sesh had gone very still. What is that? Mara had heard it exactly twice before, both times at dawn, both times from very far off, both times attached to a shape too large and too distant in the caldera haze to make sense of, a shape she had not written up in the survey record, because she had not believed her own instruments, because the mass estimate the instruments gave her was not a mass that a living thing was supposed to be able to have. She had called it, in her private field guide, the grave, from an old word for a thing too big to name, and she had put a question mark after it, and she had hoped, on some level, that she would finish her contract and leave HASP without ever finding out whether the question mark was warranted. That, Mara said, is the thing the Auric runs from. Up in the skiff, Survey Master Oskith heard the sound too, and did not know what it was, and made the second mistake of the night, which was to decide that it did not matter. He had one Dren in a crate, the yoked one alive, a smaller specimen than the Vril, but a specimen, apex fauna, the living proof he needed to control, and he had a dead pup on the path that the kennel master would tag and bag for the biosample count, and he had a contractor keeping his prize Vril alive till dawn, and the night was going better than he had hoped. HASP had apex fauna. That was no longer in question. But a world with apex fauna was not automatically a protected world. It was only a protected world if someone filed the finding and made it stick, and the only people on HASP who could file it were a strange contractor whose slate he would confiscate, a debt-bonded tech who would do as she was told, and a survey master who had every intention of filing HASP Category Ash, with a footnote about a fraudulent contractor's taxidermy hoax, and a crate of salvaged reclamation biosamples that would quietly become the private property of whoever above him had sent him down. The deep sound rolled across the plane again, closer, and the kennel master's voice came up on the channel, higher than before. Master, master, the perimeter beasts won't hold there. They're trying to dig under the skiff, master, all 6 of them there. Shock them into line. Master, I have been shocking them. They're taking the shock and still digging. I have never seen Warstock do this. Something is coming and they... Something is coming, Oskith said, because a contractor left a door open on a dead world and taught its vermin where the warm was. That is exactly why we are here. That is exactly what we are closing. He watched the plane on the descent screens, the black scree, the worn paths, the dark shut shell with its heater vapor curling thin, and the great cooling ghost by its door where something the size of his skiff had slept. Whatever is out there in that wind, Kennel Master, is one more asset that has not yet been counted. Ready the second crate. When it comes into the flood, yoke it." The deep sound came again, and this time it did not die away into the wind. This time it held and grew, and Osgoth watched his instruments try to find the mass that was making it, and watched them fail the way the contractor's instruments had failed. Watched the return come back and the readout blank and rescale and blank again. And for the first time since he had come down the gravity well, Survey Master Osgoth felt something move in him that was not calculation. But he had come too far and spent too much, and told the someone above him too many confident things to name it. So he did not name it. He watched the west, where the flood beam died into the ashwind and the dark, and he waited for his second specimen to walk into the light, and he did not understand. He would not understand until it was far too late, that the thing coming out of the caldera was not walking into his flood to be counted. It was coming because a child had come to the warm, and his beasts had killed it on the doorstep of the only kept ground on the whole murdering world. And the plane had taught the news up the food chain the way it taught everything, all the way to the top, all the way to the thing too big to name, and the thing too big to name was coming down to see about it. The Graith came into the flood a piece at a time, because it was too large to come into anything all at once. First the light found a leg, a single column of muscle and gray hide wider than the shell, coming down out of the ashwind onto the black scree with a weight that Mara felt come up through the floor and into her knees. Then a second leg. Then the flood beam climbed and found the body, a long low mountain of an animal moving on 6 of those columns, its back a ridge of armored plate that ran away into the dark beyond the reach of the light. And last of all the head came down into the flood, a head the size of the drop skiff, low-slung and blunt and scarred, with 2 eyes set deep under a shelf of horn that took the flood beam and threw it back a dull furnace amber. The auric had been the size of the skiff. The Graith made the auric a cub. The Graith made the shell a toy, and the skiff a stone, and the whole Concord detail, a scatter of small warm things caught in the open where the world could keep them. And it came out of the caldera and onto the plain and stopped at the edge of the floodlight and looked with its 2 furnace eyes, not at the skiff, not at the yokes, not at the crate, at the shell, at the door, at the 1 square meter of kept ground on the whole murdering world, where a young thing of the plain had come for warmth and been turned away into the killing dark. The Concord war beasts broke. Mara saw it through the viewport, and would remember it to the end of her days. 6 war beasts, the broken stock of 9 reclamations, bred and shocked and harnessed to kill on command, and at the sight of the Graith, or the smell of the dead pup, or some last thing left alive in them under all the breaking, they stopped digging under the skiff, and they turned as one and they ran, not into the wind, not away, but to the shell, to the door, to her. 6 broken killers throwing themselves flat against the iron of the kept ground and clawing at the seam to be let in, whining. The great scarred pack lead among them, all of them suddenly and only animals that had found the one place on the plain that was warm and still and neutral, and wanted, more than they had ever wanted anything a control yoke told them to want, to be inside it. "Open it," Sesh said. She was crying. Mara realized in the way Corvin cried, a clear fluid at the corners of all 4 eyes. "They're his, they're broken. They'll never open the door, open it, let them in." Mara opened the door. She should not have. 6 conquered war beasts and a half-drugged Virl in 4 square meters was madness, was a killing box, was everything the treaty was built to prevent. But the treaty was not about which animals were friends. The treaty had never been about that. The treaty was warm and still and neutral, the one law that mattered when the wind came up, and 6 broken things had come to the kept ground asking for it. And Mara Teal had not once in 64 nights refused the warm to anything that came to her door asking. She opened it, and the war beasts poured in around her legs, 6 of them cowering and enormous and gray, who should have torn out the throat of the first conquered killer through the door. Gray took one look at the shaking broken things flooding into the kept ground and stood down, laid its ears flat and its lip back over its teeth and stood down, and made room, because the kept ground was the kept ground. And inside the iron there was a truce, and the truce did not ask what you had done on the plane. It asked only that you come in warm and still, and leave at dawn. Mara stood in the doorway of a shell packed with a Vril and 6 defected war beasts and a weeping alien. And out on the plain the Graith took a step toward her, and the whole world shook. She did the only thing there was to do. She went out to meet it. "Contractor," the channel crackled Oskith from the skiff, and for the first time there was something under the flat administrator's calm, something high and thin. "Contractor, get away from that structure. Whatever that thing is, it is going to. The yokes cannot get to the skiff. Get to the skiff now. That is an order." Mara took the earpiece out and let it fall in the gravel. She walked out onto the worn path in the ashwind, small and unarmed and steady. Past the dead shape the acid dew was already starting to take, and she stopped in the open ground between the shell and the Graith, between the kept ground and the thing too big to name, and she looked up at a head the size of the skiff, and she did the thing she had learned on the 40th night and the 50th and the 63rd, the only thing she knew. The whole of her survey and the whole of her life on Hasp distilled to one small human act. She sat down. She sat down on the black scree in the killing wind in front of the largest living thing on the world, and she made the standing shape into the smallest sitting shape she had, and she put her open, empty hands on her knees where the 2 furnace eyes could see them, and she looked up into a face that could have taken the shell and the skiff and her together in one motion, and she hummed the 3 low dropping notes. The Graith stopped. It lowered its head. Slowly, a hand's breadth at a time, a mountain leaning down, until the blunt, scarred prow of its face came to rest on the scree in front of her, level with her, its 2 furnace eyes a meter from her own, its breath washing over her hot and vast and smelling of stone and old blood in the deep caldera, and it looked at the human sitting small and open-handed on the worn path, and it looked past her at the shell, at the door, at the low amber lamp burning steady in a plain of dark, at the kept ground where the young thing should have been safe, and Mara understood that it was not asking her the Vril's question, "Was it you?" It already knew it had not been her. The whole plain knew whose door had stayed dark and whose yokes had spun up and whose beasts had killed the pup on the path. The Graith was not asking. The Graith was deciding, the way every apex on Hasp had decided on her threshold, running the last arithmetic there was, and Mara Teal held its furnace gaze with her flat contractor's calm and her open hands and her 3 low notes, and she waited to learn what a world too big to name decided to do about the thing that had killed a child on its kept ground. "His name is Oskith," she said, quietly, to the Graith, to the plain, to nothing, the way she'd said easy to the wall for 64 nights. "He's up in the metal thing. He killed the pup, not me, him." She did not know if it understood a single sound. She knew it understood the register. "But he's caught in the open now, same as all of us, same as the pup. Same as me the day they dropped me here to die." She kept her hands open. "You do what the world does, I won't stop you, but the ones in my shell are under the kept ground, all of them, even his broken ones. They came in warm and still. They leave at dawn, that's the treaty. That's the only law I've got. You honor the kept ground, and I'll honor whatever you decide about him." The Graith held her eyes a long moment. Then it lifted its head off the scree, the mountain rising, and it turned those 2 furnace eyes up, away from the human, toward the skiff, toward the high metal thing where the survey master of the Concord Reclamation Authority sat behind a hatch with a crate of stolen assets and a dead pup on his tally, and it made the sound again, the long descending groan that came up through the rock of the whole world, and this time Mara knew what it was. It was not a hunting cry, it was a summons. They came out of the wind from every direction at once. The Dren pack, 8 of them now, back off the ridges, materializing out of the ash at the edge of the flood in their killing wedge, and behind them and above them the beat of membrane wings as the skin dropped out of the thick wind. It should never have been able to fly in, 3, 5, a dozen, venom spurs beating. And to the north the ground began to shake with a second heavy tread as the Auric came down out of the caldera haze, the auric that had knocked, drawn by the summons of the thing it ran from. And the Verls, Mara realized, the Verls were already there, had been there. A dozen gray shapes she had not seen slip into the dark at the edges of the light while she sat on the path. The whole apex weight of a living world, every kind of killing thing the plane had made. Converging out of the ashwind on the one high metal place, where the human who had killed the pup sat waiting to be counted. They did not touch the shell. They flowed around it like water around a stone, the kept ground untouched at the center of them, and they closed on the skiff. Up in the skiff, Survey Master Oskith watched a living world assemble itself against him on the descent screens, and understood at last the thing the contractor had said, and he had refused to hear, that these were not animals, and that he was not counting assets, and that he was a small warm thing caught in the open on a world that kept everything caught in the open, and that the only door on the whole plane that opened onto warmth and stillness and mercy was the door he had spent the night turning dark. Oskith tried to lift off. Mara heard the repulsors spin up, heard the skiff's belly drives claw at the air, and heard, half a second later, the sound of a lift abort, because the auric had come down out of the north and set its armored prow against the skiff's landing strut and simply leaned, the way it had leaned into her doorway, all its pewter mass against the metal, and the skiff could not lift with a mountain on its foot. The drive screamed and died. The skiff settled back onto the scree at a list, and the Dren pack flowed up over the fallen strut, and the Verls came in low around the hull, and the Graith turned its long body and put its two furnace eyes on the hatch and waited, and the whole living weight of Hasp sat down in a ring around one high metal box and went still. They were waiting. Mara understood it and felt the cold of it in her chest. They were not going to tear the skiff open. They were a world, and a world had time, and they were going to sit in the wind around the warm metal box until the cold and the ashwind and the acid dew did to the things inside it what the world did to everything caught in the open, slowly, in the dark, the way the pup had been left to be taken. They were going to keep the Concord the way the plane kept the shapes in the gravel. And they were going to do it because Oskith had turned the one door dark. Mara got up off the worn path. She walked to the skiff through the ring of apexes, and they parted for her, Dren and Verl and Skin folding aside from her path the way the war beasts had cowered and the auric had lowered its head, not because she commanded them but because she was the kept ground walking, the one warm still neutral thing, and she came to the listing hull and put her hand flat on the cold hatch and she said, loud enough to carry through the metal, Oskith, open it. They will kill us. His voice came through the hull speaker, and the flat administrator's calm was gone entirely now, stripped down to the thin thing under it. The moment this hatch opens, that thing they will. They're going to keep you, Mara said. That's worse. They're going to sit here in the wind and let the world do it slow, the way you did the pup, unless I tell them different. And the only reason I'd tell them different is if you give me a reason, and you've got about 1 minute of wind left to find one. She kept her hand on the hatch. Open it. Come out where the record can see you, and bring the crate. A long silence full of wind. Then the hatch cracked, and the warm bled out of it into the killing dark, and Survey Master Oskith came down his own listing ramp into a ring of the apex fauna of a living world. High careful step gone. The gray of his office gone gray with something else, and behind him the kennel master pushed the grav sled with the stasis crate on it, the crate with the yoked Dren alive inside it, and behind them last came Sesh, who had climbed up into the skiff at some point Mara hadn't seen, and now came down carrying her slate in both claws like a thing she meant to keep. The Graith leaned its head down out of the dark into the floodlight, over the human, over the survey master, and Oskith made a sound Mara had heard only from cornered animals, and did not run, because there was nowhere on the whole plane to run to that was not the plane. The crate, Mara said, open it, let the pack take back what's theirs. That specimen is Concord property, lawfully. There's no law out here, Oskith. You made sure of that when your beasts killed a pup on a doorstep. She did not raise her voice. She never had. There's the treaty, warm, still, neutral. You're standing in the middle of the only place on this world it doesn't reach because you turned the door dark. So here's the whole of it, Survey Master, in words even the Reclamation Authority can file. Open the crate, free the Dren, log this world alive, and I'll tell them to let you keep your warm little box and fly home in it. Or don't, and I'll walk back to my shell and I'll leave the cot empty for whatever comes, and I will not spend one more word of mine on the man who turned the door dark. She looked up at the furnace eyes leaning over them both. Your choice. A live asset at dawn or a dead one now. You came a long way. Don't leave with the wrong one. She watched him break. It was not loud and it was not gory, and it was, in its way, the most complete thing she had ever seen a person do. Survey Master Oskith of the Concord Reclamation Authority looked at the crate, and the grave, and the ring of a living world, and the small unarmed contractor who held all their leashes with 3 low notes and an open door, and he understood that every asset he had counted was uncountable, that everything he had thought was property was a citizen of a world with a claim on its own survival, that he had flown down a gravity well to close a file, and had instead opened one that would close on him. And he bent, and he keyed the crate, and the stasis field died, and the yoked Dren came up out of the box wild and staggering and was met by its pack, 8 narrow gray bodies pressing around it, folding it back into the wedge. And the whole pack turned as one, and looked at the man who had put it in the box. Leave him, Mara said. The pack held. The grave held. The whole ring of the plane held on the edge of the floodlight, and Survey Master Oskith stood in the center of it, having just been shown, in front of his kennel master and his tech and the unblinking record of Sesh's slate, that his life was not his own to keep, that it hung on the word of a contractor he had come to certify as a fraud or a corpse, and that she had chosen, in front of everyone, to spend that word on mercy he had not earned and could never repay. There is a kind of losing that is worse than dying, and Oskith did it standing up in the wind, while a woman in field fatigues told a world too big to name to leave him be, and every creature on the plain obeyed her and not him. Log the world, Mara said, gentler now, because the fight was out of it and there was only the work left. Say it into your own record, Survey Master, in your own voice so it can't be unsaid. HASP is a living world. It has apex fauna with problem-solving intelligence and social transmission and territorial treaty behavior. It carries a claim on its own survival under charter. It is not category Ash. Say it. For a moment she thought he wouldn't. For a moment the office in him tried to stand back up, tried to find the angle, the footnote, the someone above him. Then the grave's breath washed hot over them both out of the cold, and Oskith closed his eyes, and said it, into his own record in his own voice, every word she gave him, because there was nothing else left in the whole murdering dark for him to do. Sesh caught it all on her slate. And then, quietly, without being told, she did the thing that made her a criminal to the Concord, and something better than a contract tech to herself. She flagged the recording priority 1 biosphere finding, sealed it against edit, and pushed it up the hardened channel to the Reclamation Authority's central record, where no survey master and no someone above him could ever quietly make it go away. A living world certification for HASP, witnessed, sealed, in the survey master's own voice, filed before dawn. It's done, Sesh said. Her 4 eyes were wet again and her voice shook, but the slate in her claws was steady. It's in the record, it can't be closed now. HASP is protected. The strippers can't come. It's done. The grave lifted its head off the humans, up into the wind, and made the descending groan one more time softer, and all across the plain, the ring of the apex fauna of a living world began to loosen and turn, and melt back into the ashwind, Dren and Verl and Skin and Auric. The summons answered, and the kept ground honored, and the man who turned the door dark left standing alive in the gravel with his empty crate, which was the worst thing they could have done to him and the truest. Because he would have to fly home in his warm little box and tell the someone above him that he had gone down to HASP to close a dead world, and had instead certified it alive in his own sealed voice, at the word of a contractor and the sufferance of a beast. And there was no footnote in the whole charter that could make that anything but what it was. The Graith was the last to go. It turned its long, low mountain of a body back toward the caldera, and then it stopped, and it swung its scarred head around, and it looked once more at the shell at the door, at the low amber lamp still burning steady through all of it, at the kept ground it had not touched, and it looked at the human standing small in the middle of the emptying plain, and it lowered its head to her one last time, all the way down, the furnace eyes level with hers, and it held there a moment. Then it went, and the ground shook with its going, and the wind began at last near dawn to fall. Dawn on Hasp came gray and still, the way it always did, the ashwind falling away to nothing and the sky going from bruise to the color of old iron, and Mara Teal walked back across the emptying plain to a shell packed with warm bodies and did not know yet that the fight was not finished. It never was with the Concord. She would learn that before the sun cleared the ridges. The 6 war beasts were still inside. That was the first problem. They had come in off the plain in terror, and they had spent the last of the night pressed into the corners of the shell with Gray holding the center, and now the wind had fallen and the treaty said leave at dawn, but the war beasts did not leave. They lifted their heavy heads when Mara came through the door, and they watched her with an expression she had seen on exactly one other animal on Hasp, the healed dren, the backward look, the look that meant a debt had been noted. They did not want to go back out onto the plain. More than that, they did not want to go back to the ramp, to the harness, to the yoke and the shock collar and the killing on command. They had found the kept ground, and they had found the one shape on the plain that sat down in the dark and did not stand, and a thing that has been broken its whole life will crawl a long way toward the first hand that does not hurt it. They won't come back to the detail, the kennel master said from the doorway. He had followed her across the plain because there was nowhere else on Hasp to go, and he stood now looking at his 6 beasts arrayed around the human in the warm, and his voice was strange. He was an old hand. Mara could see the years of the harness on him the way she could see them on the beasts. I've run Warstock for 30 years, contractor. Once they break for someone, they're broken to them. That's how the breaking works. I put the yoke on them and made them mine that way. He looked at the beasts, at the human, and something moved in his weathered face. You didn't put anything on them. They just chose. I didn't know they could still do that. I didn't know there was enough left in them to choose. There's always enough left to choose the warm, Mara said. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing I found out here. She crouched slow among the war beasts and put her open hand flat where the scarred pack lead could reach it, and the old brute leaned its heavy scarred head into her palm and shuddered, and made the whining sound, and Mara scratched the ridge behind its jaw the way she'd never quite dared to scratch Gray. You want to keep running them on the yoke, kennel master, after tonight? No, the old alien said, and it came out of him rough like something pulled up by the root. No, I don't believe I do. Then that's the second finding for the record, Mara said. Concord Warstock, presented with a choice, chose against the harness. Have your tech log it. She looked up at Sesh in the doorway, and Sesh, wet-eyed, already had her slayed up. Outside, the Dren pack had not gone far. Mara found them when she went out into the dawn to do the thing she had been dreading, to walk to the shape in the gravel that the acid dew had begun to take, the young one, the pup. The pack was there before her, the 8 of them and the freed 9th, gathered around the small ruined shape in the gray light, and they were not eating it and they were not leaving it. They were standing over it, the way she had seen the pack stand over the hurt 1 week ago, and when Mara came up they did not warn her off. They let her come. They let her kneel beside, not over, presenting no height, the way the whole world had taught her, and they let her gather the small cold body up in her arms. And they walked with her, the whole pack, a gray escort in the iron light, out past the worn paths to the lee of the boulder where she had first seen a Virl watching her a lifetime ago, and they stood in a ring while she scraped a hollow in the scree with her hands and her field spade, and laid the pup in it, and covered it over with the black gravel, deep below where the acid dew could reach, so the world would not keep it after all. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that a Dren would understand, and nothing she trusted her voice to hold. But she hummed the 3 low notes over the little grave once, and the pack stood and listened. And when she was done, the healed Dren, the one she had tended, the one that had carried the news of the open door up and down the ridges, came and stood in front of her and looked at her the backward look close, and then turned and led the pack away north toward the glass ridges. And Mara knelt by the small grave in the dawn and let herself, for the second time on hasp, cry where something could see her. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. The skiff's drive spun up behind her. Mara came around and saw it, the skiff, righted now, the Auric long gone back to the caldera, nothing holding it to the ground anymore, its repulsors clawing it up off the scree. And she saw the shape of what Oscith was doing before she fully understood it, because she had learned to read what a thing meant under what it did. And a survey master who had been broken in front of his own crew and certified a living world in his own sealed voice was a survey master with exactly one asset left in the whole disaster, and that asset was distance. He was leaving. He was leaving her, and the kennel master who had turned, and the tech who had sealed the record, on a world with a 200-day contract and a 14-hour night, and he was going to fly up to his barge and tell the someone above him a story, that the contractor and the crew had been lost to the fauna, that the sealed finding was the raving of a strange dead woman and a debt-bonded criminal, that hasp had closed as a tragedy after all. He could not unseal the record, but he could make sure that everyone who had witnessed it was a corpse on a Category Ash world by the time anyone came to ask, and a corpse's testimony was worth exactly nothing. He was going to do the pup again, at scale, turn the door dark on all of them and let the world do it slow. Sesh, Mara was already running, back across the worn paths toward the shell, toward the channel, toward anything. The barge, can you reach the barge over his head, can you? He's locked the channel, Sesh called back at the shell's console, her claws flying. He's routing all comms through the skiff, Mara, he's the only uplink. If he leaves we can't. We have 200 days of ration and a 14-hour night and no way to call, And then the skiff, rising 20 meters up and climbing, stopped. It stopped in the air with its drive screaming, and Mara looked up and saw the skin. They came out of the falling wind in a stoop, the way she had watched a single skin take a plane's runner in one silent drop. But not one skin now. A dozen, 2 dozen. The venom gliders that should have denned at dawn come up off the ridges into the last of the wind, and folding their wings and dropping onto the rising skiff, onto its lift vanes, onto the hot exposed housings of its repulsor drives, and their venom spurs raked the intakes and their weight fouled the vanes, and the skiff staggered in the air. Drives coughing, and Mara understood that the plane had not finished with Survey Master Oscith after all. The grave had let him keep his warm box on her word. But the world had taught the news up and down its whole range in the night, the door that went dark, the pup on the path, the man in the metal, and a world that could teach a skin to do what a Verl did could teach it too, that the metal thing trying to climb into the sky was the thing that had turned the door dark, and that it was, for one more moment, still caught in the open. The skiff came down hard. Not a crash, Oscith was too good a pilot for that, even breaking, even ruined, but a hard controlled slam back onto the scree, drives fouled, vanes bent, the skin peeling off it as it fell and wheeling away into the dawn, their work done, leaving a grounded skiff that would not fly again without a repair yard, and a survey master sealed inside it on a living world he had certified alive in his own voice, with no uplink he could use that the tech could not now also reach, and nowhere in the whole charter to go. Mara walked to the skiff for the second time in one night. She did not put her hand on the hatch this time. She stood in front of it in the iron dawn and she waited, and after a while the hatch cracked and Oscith looked out at her, and there was nothing left in his face at all. "You can't fly," Mara said. "The drives are fouled. You're going to be on hasp until a repair skiff comes down for you, and the only channel that's going to reach the barge is the tech's, and she's already put the finding on the record, sealed, so there's no story you can tell up there now that the record won't call a lie. She said it flat, no gloating in it, because there was no pleasure to take from a broken thing, and because gloating was the standing shape and she had learned better. Here's what happens now. You come out of the box. You live in the shell with the rest of us, warm and still under the kept ground, until they come to take you home to answer for your file. You leave the fauna alone. You leave my crew alone. And every night when the wind comes up, you sit where I tell you and you keep your hands where they can see them and you keep quiet, same as everyone, same as the tech, same as me. She stepped back from the hatch. That's the treaty, Survey Master. It doesn't ask what you did on the plane. It only asks that you come in warm and still. Even you, even now, that's the part you never understood about it. It's the last mercy on a world that has no others, and it's yours if you want it, and it costs you exactly one thing. Oscath's voice when it came was barely anything. What? You leave the cot empty, Mara said. It's not for you. It's never going to be for you. It's for whatever the wind brings. You sleep on the floor with the rest of us, and you leave the second cot turned down, and you learn to hum 3 notes at the dark, and maybe by the time they come to take you home, you'll understand what you flew down here to kill. She turned back toward the shell, toward the low amber lamp still burning steady in the iron dawn, toward the 6 war beasts and the Virl and the Tech and the Kennel Master, toward the whole strange, warm, impossible household the wind had built her out of the things the Concord had thrown away. Or don't. Stay in your box. But the drives are fouled either way, Survey Master, and the night out here is 14 hours long, and the only warm on this whole world is the warm you tried to put in a crate. She left him the choice. It was the only thing on HASP she had ever had to give anything, the open door, the low lamp, the choice. And she had never once refused it to a thing that came asking, and she did not refuse it now, even to him, because the day she started refusing it was the day the kept ground stopped being kept. Behind her, after a long time, she heard the hatch open the rest of the way, and the slow, careful step of a broken thing coming down a ramp onto the black gravel of a world it no longer owned. It took the Concord 11 days to send anyone down, and they were the strangest 11 days of Mara Teal's life, which was saying a great deal for a life that had lately included a mountain lowering its head to her in the dark. The shell was built for 2, and now it held 5 people and a Virl, and most nights 6 war beasts, and the arithmetic of that should not have worked and somehow did, because the treaty scaled the way the treaty always had. Warm, still, neutral. Gray held the center of the floor, and the war beasts held the corners, and the humans and the Corvin held the walls, and the second cot stayed empty and turned down for whatever the wind brought, and every night the wind brought something, and every night the whole strange household learned again to sit down and show their hands and keep quiet while a killing thing came in out of the dark to sleep among them. Oscath learned it slowest, but he learned it. Mara watched it happen the way she'd watched everything happen on HASP, at the edge of her eye without pushing. The first night the Survey Master sat in the corner farthest from the door with his back rigid and his 4 eyes on the hatch, and when the skin came in on the thin wind and folded its venom-spurred wings onto the empty cot he made a sound and half rose, and Mara said sit, without turning around, the way she'd say it to a war beast, and he sat, and the skin slept, and in the morning it left him breathing, and something in the rigid line of him bent a little. The third night it was the auric, head in the door and body in the wind, and Oscath watched a human get up in the dark and drape a blanket over the armored prow of the largest predator he had ever seen, and he did not understand it, but he watched it, and Mara saw him watching and did not say anything, because some lessons only take if the wind teaches them. On the 6th night Oscath got up on his own, slow, hands visible, and turned the lamp down to its lowest amber before Mara could, because he had noticed at last that the white startled them and the amber settled them, and Mara let him do it, and that was the whole of his apology, and they both knew it, and it was enough. Sesh spent the 11 days building the record. She could not stop. Mara understood it. The tech had sealed one finding in a night of terror, and now she had 11 days and a live world outside the door, and every hour of it went into the slate. She logged the rotation, night by night, which animal on which wind. She logged the war beast's defection and the kennel master's turning. She logged the Dren pack's return twice to a door that had been made dark and had opened again. And she logged because she was a tech and could not help it, the thing that had no field for it. The thing Mara had never dared write in the Concord's record, the treaty itself, the kept ground, the whole impossible fact of it. And she gave it, in the record, a name. I had to call it something, Sesh said, on the 9th night, almost shy, showing Mara the slate. The finding needs a designation or the authority won't file it. I could not write treaty. There is no charter category for a treaty with fauna. So she turned the slate. On it, in the clean Concord finding script, under a designation code and a sealed witness stamp, she had entered it. Hearth kept ground. A defined term. Below it, her tech's careful definition. A structure or place maintained warm, still, and weaponless by a keeper, recognized by a world's apex fauna as neutral refuge, honored across species and against instinct, transmitted by social learning, constituting evidence of a living world claim. Mara looked at it a long time. A soft border world custom, her leaving a bed made and a lamp low, turned into a defined term in the record of a reclamation authority, a piece of charter law with a stamp on it. And she thought about the way the aliens made doctrine out of the smallest human things, the way the kennel master would probably teach it now to whatever came after him, the way there would be, someday. Concord techs who had never seen hasp solemnly citing Hearth kept ground in a survey brief, as though it were a protocol, and not a woman leaving a door on the latch in the bad seasons, because she could not stand to let the wind have one more. Hearth kept ground, Mara said. It'll do. It is in the permanent record, Sesh said, sealed. When the authority reviews the HASP file, they will have to define their terms against it. They cannot strip a world that contains Hearth kept ground. It is load-bearing now. It holds up the whole finding. Her 4 eyes were bright. You built it out of a spare cot, and now it holds up a world. There was one bad night in the 11, and it came on the 8th, and it was the night Oskith stopped being a prisoner in the shell and started being a part of it, though none of them would have called it that at the time. The wind came up thick and then thicker, worse than any night since the drop, and it brought 2 of them at once, the Auric out of the caldera, head in the door and body in the wind, and, an hour behind it, Gray, come up the worn path through the gale to find the doorway it had used 40 times already full of a pewter mountain. Mara heard the Vril check on the path, heard the change in its gait, and she was up and moving before she'd finished waking, because 2 apexes that gave each other a wide cold berth on the open plain had never yet been asked to share the kept ground, and she did not know if the treaty stretched that far. It stretched, but it stretched through her, and she had to be in the middle of it for it to hold. She sat down in the doorway between them, the Auric's armored prow on one side, huge and warm and half asleep, and Gray on the other, out in the wind, ears flat, saber-tusks bright, doing an arithmetic it had never had to do before, and she hummed the 3 notes at the Vril and held one open hand toward the Auric's lowered head and said, flat and steady, both. There's room, warm and still, both of you. Leave it be, Gray. Come in. And the Vril looked at the mountain, and looked at the human sitting small and unarmed between them, and came in low along the wall, as far from the Auric as 4 square meters allowed, and lay down against Mara's own bunk with its clear eye fixed on the Auric's closed one all night, and did not sleep, not really, but did not fight, and that was the treaty holding across the one gap Mara had feared it couldn't cross. Oskith watched the whole of it from his corner, and afterward, in the dead middle of that thick wind night, with a mountain breathing in the door and a saber cat rigid against the wall, and the 6 broken beasts pressed into the far corner, the survey master of the Concord Reclamation Authority spoke for the first time since the crate. "I do not understand how it holds," he said, very low so as not to wake anything. "There is no dominance in it, you have not cowed them. A Vril that hates that auric is lying still an arm's length from it because you told it there was room. That is not command. Command I understand. I have spent my life inside command." His 4 eyes moved over the impossible, warm, crowded dark of the shell. "What is this if it is not command?" "It's a promise," Mara said. "That's all it ever was. I promised the first one the wind was locked out and I'd keep it out, and I kept it, and the world's been passing the promise around ever since." She scratched the ridge behind Gray's jaw and felt the enormous tension in it slowly ease. "You can't command a thing that could kill you, Survey Master. You found that out on the path, but you can promise it something and then keep the promise every night until it decides to believe you. That's the only power out here that isn't fear. It's slower than fear. It's worth more." She looked at him across the dark. "You spent your life inside command because command is fast. This is what's left when you stop being in a hurry to own things." Oscith did not answer. But in the morning, when the auric drew its head out of the door and Gray slipped out after it into the ash-gray dawn and the wind fell, the Survey Master got up on his own before Mara and turned the lamp down to its lowest amber for the next night without being asked, and set the treaty blanket folded on the empty cot with his own careful claws. And that was the 8th night, and after it he was different, and the shell was a household of 5 and not 4 and a prisoner, and Sesh logged that too. The repair skiff came down on the 11th day, and it did not come alone. Mara had expected a repair crew and a security detail in trouble. What came down was a repair crew and a security detail and a charter arbiter. An independent officer of the sort the Reclamation Authority was obligated to seat when a living world claim was filed and sealed against a Survey Master's own certification. An old Corvan in the deep blue of the arbitration bench who came down the ramp with the careful step of great age and great authority, and stood on the black scree of hasp, looking at a survey shell scored floor to roof with the claw marks of a dozen apex species, and at the 6 Concord war beasts arrayed loose and unharnessed around a human contractor, and at Survey Master Oscith standing quiet and gray among them with his rank gone soft on his shoulders. "I have read the sealed finding," the arbiter said to Mara without preamble. "I have read the term your tech entered. I have flown a very long way, contractor, because a Survey Master does not certify a world alive against his own contract and his own interest unless something extraordinary compelled him to, and the record does not adequately explain what." 2 of the 4 ancient eyes moved to Oscith and away. "I am not here to take your word or his or the tech's. I am here to see it. The finding claims this world's apex fauna honor a neutral ground across species and against instinct. I will stay 1 night. If the wind brings me what the record promises, HASP is protected under charter and this becomes settled law. If it does not," the old eyes came back to Mara, not unkind, "then I fly home and this file closes the way a Survey Master's certification under duress usually closes, and you will all answer for a great deal. 1 night, contractor. Show me the kept ground." "I don't show it," Mara said. "That's the thing your record can't quite hold, arbiter. I don't do anything. I sit down and I leave a bed empty and I keep the lamp low and the world decides. All I can promise you is the door will be open and the wind will come up, and after that it's not mine to promise." She stepped aside from the shell's hatch into the failing light and gestured the old alien in. "Come in out of the wind. Sit where I point. Keep your hands where they can see them. And whatever comes through that door tonight, arbiter, don't stand up." The charter arbiter of the Reclamation Authority, who had flown a very long way and settled worlds with a word, looked at the small, unarmed human and at the open door and at the bruise coming up in the western sky, and then, slowly, with great dignity, did as she was told. The wind came up an hour after dark, and Hasp, which had never once in Mara's knowing failed to bring something to a door left open, did not fail her now. It brought, that night of all the nights, on the one night it mattered most, the grave. The arbiter heard it first as everyone heard it first, up through the rock, the long descending groan, and Mara watched the old alien's composure hold, and then break as the flood of understanding reached it that the sound was not distant and not an instrument's error but a living mass approaching in the dark. And she put her hand flat on the old Corven's shoulder before it could rise and said, very quiet, sit. Hands. Quiet. This is the top of the whole world coming to your record, arbiter. Don't waste it standing up. And the Graith came, a piece at a time, too large to come all at once, its furnace eyes filling the doorway that could never hold it, its breath fogging the whole shell white, and it looked in past the human at the crowd of warm things it did not touch. The tech, the kennel master, the broken war beasts, the ruined survey master, the ancient arbiter frozen wide-eyed against the wall, and it laid its scarred prow down in the open doorway in the warm, the way the auric had, the way everything had. And it closed its two furnace eyes, and it slept. And the charter arbiter of the Concord Reclamation Authority sat 3 meters from the largest living thing on the world with a woman's steadying hand on its shoulder, and watched the kept ground hold against instinct and dark and the whole weight of a murdering world, and did not, to its lasting credit, stand up. In the morning, when the Graith had drawn its head out of the door and turned its mountain of a body back toward the caldera and lowered it once, briefly, to the human on the worn path and gone, the arbiter came out into the iron dawn and stood a long time looking at the empty plain and the worn paths and the low shell with its lamp still burning. Settled, it said at last, and its old voice was not quite steady. HASP is a living world. It holds a claim on its own survival, witnessed and confirmed. No charter of strip or reclamation will issue against it while the record stands, and the record will stand. It turned to Mara. There is no precedent for what comes next, contractor, so I am going to make one here this morning on my authority, and let them argue it in the courts for the next 100 years. A living world with a defined hearth-kept ground requires a keeper of record. The finding names you. The fauna name you in the only grammar they have. I am seating you. The ancient eyes held hers. Warden of HASP, it is not a reward. It is a sentence and a duty, and it will likely be the rest of your life. You will keep the ground. You will keep the record. You will keep the world's claim against every survey master who ever again flies down that gravity well thinking a plane full of killing things is a plane full of uncounted assets. A pause. Do you accept? Mara Teal looked at the empty plain where a mountain had just lowered its head to her, and at the shell where a spare cot waited turned down for the next night's wind, and she thought about a loadmaster who had not looked at her, and a Concord that had dropped her here to die and left one cot empty without ever imagining what would come to fill it. I accept, she said. They took Oskith up on the repair skiff when it lifted, 3 days later, once the drives were clean and the arbitration record was sealed, and there was nothing left on HASP for a broken survey master to do but go home and answer for his file. He came to Mara before they loaded him. She was at the little grave by the boulder. She went there most mornings now, a habit she did not examine, and he came across the worn paths in the iron light with his rank stripped off his shoulders and his careful high step gone. Just a tall gray alien walking on a plane that had beaten him, and he stopped the prudent 10 meters away out of an old reflex, and then, deliberately, closed it to 3. I have thought about what I will say up there, he said, to the ones who sent me. I have thought about it for 11 nights, sitting on the floor of your shell, leaving your cot empty. He looked at the grave, at the black gravel mounded over the pup. I am going to tell them the truth, not because I have become good, I have not, but because the tech sealed the record and there is no longer any profit in the lie, and I have spent my whole life choosing between the truth and the profit, and I no longer have the profit, so I may as well have the truth. I am going to tell them HASP is alive. I am going to tell them what a hearth-kept ground is, and I am going to tell them that I flew down a gravity well to close a dead world and was closed myself by a contractor and a beast, and that it was the correct outcome. His 4 eyes came to hers. I do not expect you to forgive me. I killed a child on your doorstep. That is not a thing forgiveness reaches. No, Mara said, it isn't. But you left the cot empty for me anyway. That's not forgiveness, Survey Master. That's the treaty. It doesn't ask what you did on the plane. She stood up from the grave and brushed the black grit off her knees. You want to do something with the truth you're carrying up there, do this. Every world your authority has closed category ash, everyone, all the way back you go and you make them look again. Because if HASP read dead and wasn't, then some of the others read dead and weren't either, and there are cots that were never left empty on worlds that got taken apart for their iron, and things that came to dark doors and were kept by the wind because no one opened them. She held his eyes. That's your sentence, not the court's. Mine, go be the man who makes them look again. It won't make you good, but it'll make you useful, and on this world that's the higher thing. Oscith was quiet a moment. Then he inclined his armored head, the deep bow of a corvan to a seated authority, the bow a survey master gave to no contractor, and he turned and walked back across the worn paths to the skiff, and Mara watched the reclamation authority carry away the man who had come to strip her world, and did not feel triumph, because triumph was the standing shape, and because there was a grave by the boulder that no verdict would fill. Sesh did not go up on the skiff. My bond is void, she said when Mara found her at the shell's console not packing. I filed a priority finding against my own survey master. The moment I did that, the Concord will have flagged my debt bond forfeit and my clutch standing struck. I cannot go back. There is nothing to go back to. She did not sound afraid of it. She sounded, for the first time since she had come down the ramp on corpse detail, like someone who had set a weight down. And there is, she gestured at the shell, the plane, the worn paths, the war beasts drowsing in the dawn. There is a living world here that needs a record kept, and a warden who cannot hold a slate and a lamp and a treaty all at once forever. The arbiter's seating allows a deputy of record. Her 4 eyes came up, uncertain under the boldness. I grew up leaving the buyer door on the latch, warden. I know how to keep a door open in the bad seasons and take nothing and let the cast-out things come in warm. I have known how my whole life and been told my whole life it was a soft, foolish border world thing that no proper clutch would keep. A breath. I would like to keep it here where it turns out to be load-bearing, if you will have me. Deputy Warden of HASP, Mara said, and tried the shape of it and found it good. The pay's terrible. The nights are 14 hours. Most of your colleagues have too many teeth. She put out her hand open, the way she'd learned to put it out to everything on this world, and after a moment Sesh laced her manipulator claws carefully into it, alien and human, the first time either of them had touched another person in longer than they'd say. Yeah, Mara said. I'll have you. Welcome to the kept ground. The kennel master stayed too in the end, and that Mara had not expected, but the arithmetic of it made its own sense once she stopped being surprised. He could not take 6 defected war beasts back to a Concord kennel. The Concord would have destroyed them as compromised stock, and he could not do that, not anymore, not after the night he'd watched the last thing left in them choose the warm. So he stayed, an old alien who had run Warstock for 30 years and had nothing left to run it for, and he learned, slower even than Oscith, that a beast you did not break was a different animal than a beast you did, and that the 6 broken things were, under the breaking, capable of a loyalty no yoke had ever gotten out of them. A loyalty they gave now to the kept ground and the woman who sat down in the dark, and gave, gradually, to the old man who stopped shocking them and started scratching the ridge behind their jaws instead. By the time the next survey season turned, there were 9 of them in the household the wind had built: Mara, Sesh, the kennel master, and the 6 war beasts plus Gray, who was not of the household and never would be, who still came only when the thick wind drove it in and still left at every dawn without a backward look, but who had begun, on the worst nights, to sleep not on the cot but on the floor beside Mara's own bunk. Close enough that she woke sometimes with her hand fallen onto its frost-gray flank and its enormous heart going slow and steady under her palm, and did not move it, and slept again. Word got out the way word does. The HASP finding went into the permanent record and could not be unsealed, and living world claims were rare enough that it drew notice, and hearth kept ground was a strange enough term that it drew more, and within a year there were other techs on other worlds citing it, and within 2 there was a charter amendment with the term baked into it, and a slow grinding review of old category ash closings that Oskith, still employed, to everyone's surprise, reassigned to the review board itself. The man who makes them look again pushed through world by world by world. Some of the reviewed worlds read dead and were dead, but not all of them. 3, in the first year of the review, read wrong the way HASP had read wrong, and the strip charters were pulled, and somewhere on each of them, Mara liked to think, there was a door that could be left open now, and a cot that could be left empty, and a wind that would bring something to it. One of the 3 sent word, through the record, in the flat channel script of a surveyor who did not yet have better words. A contractor on a rimward ice world, the Concord, had closed category ash 8 years before. A woman like Mara, dropped cheap and left to freeze, had held on long enough in the review's reprieve to learn that the thing tunneling under her station was not undermining it but denning against its heat, and had written to the only other keeper of record in the whole charter to ask, without quite asking, whether she was going mad. Mara wrote back 4 words: leave the door open. She sent it warden to keeper, sealed, and she did not explain it, because there was no explaining it, there was only the doing of it, one cold night at a time, until the thing under the ice decided the woman at the heat was not the enemy. 6 months later, the ice world filed its own living world claim, and cited hearth kept ground, and named its own keeper, and Mara read the finding twice in the low amber light, and thought that, whatever else the Concord had done to her, it had accidentally taught the whole charter a thing the charter had spent 1,000 years too busy owning worlds to learn. That the last mercy on a killing world was a door left open, and that a species which could not leave one open had no business calling anything beneath it. She kept the letter. It was the first mail she had gotten on HASP that was not a threat or an order, and it was 4 words long, hers, sent out into the dark to another woman alone with the cold, and it had grown a world. She did not leave HASP. She had accepted the sentence and the duty, and she meant it, and there was nowhere she wanted to go that was better than the plain where a mountain lowered its head to her in the dark. The Concord tried twice to buy the world's claim out from under the finding with lawyers and reclassification petitions, and both times the record held and the arbiter's precedent held, and the term sesh had entered in a night of terror held, load-bearing, holding up a world. And every night, no matter what the lawyers filed or the petitions claimed, the wind came up out of the caldera an hour after dark, and the warden of HASP turned the lamp down to its lowest amber, and left one cot empty and turned down, and hummed 3 low notes at the door, and waited to see what the world would bring her. A year and some months into her wardenship, on a night the wind came up thick and mean out of the caldera, Mara Teal sat at the fold-down work table of a survey shell that was a warden station now, and logged the world, and did not once turn around to look at what was on the empty cot. Old habits, the best ones. She kept her back to it because that was still the whole of the treaty, and behind her the Dren breathed, one of the pack, the healed one, come alone tonight the way it did sometimes, the old debt still running between them in a grammar neither of them had words for. And across the shell, the 6 war beasts held the corners, and the kennel master snored in his bunk, and Sesh worked her own slate by the low amber, building the record that held up a world. Gray was out on its plane tonight. The wind was thick but not killing, and on the merely thick nights the Vril still chose the hunt, and Mara would hear it later far off, the cough and scream of a Vril on a kill, and she would log that too, and be glad of it, because a world where the apex still hunted was a world that was still alive, still keeping its own, still exactly what she had been sent to certify dead, and had certified instead, extravagantly and murderously and gloriously alive. She finished the night's log, she saved it, she did not stand. "Warden," Sesh said quietly from the wall. She had her head tilted, the way she did when the old childhood instinct woke in her before the trained mind caught up. "Do you feel that?" Mara felt it. Up through the floor plates first, the way she'd felt it the first time and every time since, the long deep tread that came up through the rock of the whole world. The dren on the cot lifted its narrow head. The war beasts stirred in their corners, and out on the plain, over the scream of the thick wind, came the sound that had once frozen her blood and now did something else to it entirely. The long descending groan, the summons, the voice of the thing too big to name. The grave did not come often. 3 or 4 times a year, no pattern Mara had ever found, out of the caldera and down onto the plain to the one warm still thing on the whole murdering world, for reasons that were its own and that she had stopped trying to survey. It came when it came. And when it came, the warden of Hasp got up from her work table slowly, the sitting shape becoming the standing shape as gently as 16 months of practice had taught her, and turned the lamp to its lowest amber, and went to the door, and opened it to the wind. It filled the doorway it could never pass, a piece at a time, too large to come all at once, and its furnace eyes found her in the low light, and its breath fogged the whole warden station white, and it laid its scarred prow down in the open door, in the warm, in the still, on the kept ground it had honored since the night it first lowered its head to a small, unarmed human sitting open-handed on a worn path. Mara got the blanket. She kept one by the door now always, the grave's blanket, though it covered barely the animal's brow, and draped it over the armored prow, and the furnace eye came open and looked at her and closed again, and she sat down in the doorway between the mountain and the wind, the way she had the first night, the way she supposed she always would, and she hummed the 3 low notes her grandmother had hummed over a stove a very long way from here. So worn down by repetition that they were not a tune anymore, only a shape of sound that meant the day was closing, and it was safe to stop watching the dark. And the grave answered it. 3 notes, low, dropping up out of a chest the size of a skiff, not the same notes, never the same notes. A thing at the top of a living world had no more idea of a tune than the wind did, but 3 sounds, dropping in the same shape and answer, and the whole warden station went still to hear it. The dren and the war beasts and the alien deputy and the old kennel master. All of them holding their breath, while the human and the mountain traded a scrap of song across the threshold of the only kept ground on the whole world. Mara Teal had come to Hasp with 200 days of ration bricks, and a slate, and a spare cot the Concord had left empty, because it expected her to die alone. She had left the cot empty on purpose, in the end. And the world had filled it, a different killing thing each night the wind came up, Virl and Dren and Skin and Auric, and on the deep rare nights, the thing too big to name, each one doing its own hunter's arithmetic on her threshold and choosing, one after another, across every instinct that told it not to, that the small still shape at the table was not the enemy, that the enemy was the wind, and that the wind was locked out. And that inside the iron there was a truce that asked nothing, but that you come in warm and still and leave at dawn. They had never made her their master, she had never wanted to be. She was their neutral ground, the 1 square meter of a murdering world where nothing had to fight, and that was a higher thing than master, and she had built it out of nothing but a folded blanket and a low lamp and a stubborn refusal, on principle, to let the wind have one more. The Concord had dropped her on Hasp to read a dead world and sign its death. Instead she had read it alive, and the world had read her the same, and now the top of the whole food chain slept with its head in her doorway and answered her grandmother's song in the dark. And there was a term in the permanent record with a stamp on it that no survey master could ever unseal, and it was holding up a world, and it had her name under it as keeper, and it would likely be the rest of her life. The wind screamed against the iron, the lamp burned low and amber and steady. The grave breathed its enormous breaths in the doorway, and the dren slept on the empty cot, and the deputy and the old man and the 6 broken beasts slept warm and safe in the corners of the kept ground, and Mara sat in the open door between all of it and the killing dark, unarmed, unafraid, exactly where she had chosen to be, and she pulled the treaty blanket a little higher on the mountain's brow, and settled her back against the warm iron and let the guard come down. "Easy," she said, low, to the animal, to the household, to the whole living world at her back. "Nobody's going anywhere." And on the worst world the Concord had ever tried to kill, on a plain of black gravel under a bruise-colored sky, that turned out to be the truest thing anyone had ever said. Nobody was going anywhere. The cot would be empty again tomorrow and turned down and warm, and the wind would come, and the world would bring her whatever the wind had caught in the open, and the warden of Hasp would open the door, because she had never once refused the warm to a thing that came asking, and she was not going to start now, and that in the end was the whole of it. One cot left empty, one door left open, one human who would not stand up in the dark. It had been enough to keep a world,